The story of the Cherokee begins deep in the valleys and ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, where rolling hills stretch into the horizon and ancient rivers carve their way through the land. Long before outsiders ever laid eyes upon these landscapes, the ancestors of the Cherokee had already formed a relationship with the forests, rivers and fields that define their world. This connection to place was not incidental. It shaped every detail of their identity, from how they built their homes to how they understood their role in the broader cycle of life. Archaeologists and historians trace the earliest presence of these ancestral people to thousands of years ago, during a period when the eastern woodlands were still sparsely populated by groups moving gradually into settled ways of life. Over time, these early communities established patterns of subsistence that blended hunting, fishing, and foraging with the cultivation of native plants. The land provided persimmons, acorns, chestnuts, berries, and medicinal herbs, while rivers and streams gave them fish and freshwater mussels. Deer and wild turkey were hunted, both for food and for their hides and feathers, which were used in clothing, tools, and ritual items. The geography of the Appalachians allowed for a diversity of resources, which supported the growth of stable villages and laid the foundation for the cultural identity that would one day be recognized as distinctly Cherokee. Linguistic evidence places the Cherokee within the larger Iroquoian family, linking them to peoples further north such as the Huron and the Haudenosaunee. Yet despite those distant connections, the Cherokee developed in relative isolation from their northern relatives, carving out a separate identity in the southeast. Scholars have long debated when the ancestors of the Cherokee migrated into the Appalachian region. Some theories suggest they had been present there since the late Archaic period, while others believe they moved down from areas around the Great Lakes much later. Whatever the timeline, what is certain is that by the first millennium of the Common Era, the Cherokee were firmly established across a wide expanse of the southern highlands, spreading across what would become parts of modern Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Alabama. The earliest evidence of settled life can be seen in the remains of large village sites, sometimes fortified with palisades centered around communal spaces. These settlements often featured council houses, large circular structures built from wood and clay that could hold entire communities for ceremonies and decision-making. Surrounding them were clusters of homes, rectangular dwellings constructed from logs, wattle, and daub. Life revolved around extended families and clans, with kinship ties forming the foundation of social organization. Even at this early stage, one can see the beginnings of the social structure that later Cherokee communities would maintain with remarkable continuity. Their worldview was inseparable from their landscape. Mountains were not simply geographic features, but living entities with power and presence. Rivers and springs were sources of life, but also spiritual thresholds. The Cherokee believed that balance between the human world and the natural world was essential, and this balance was maintained through rituals, taboos, and a profound respect for the unseen forces that governed existence. Oral traditions would later describe how animals and plants once spoke to people, and how rules were set in place to ensure harmony. These traditions likely grew from a worldview that had been shaped over centuries of living so intimately with the land. As their settlements grew, agriculture became more important. Early farming centered on squash and sunflowers, native plants that were cultivated alongside foraged foods. Over time, the introduction of maize or corn transformed Cherokee society. Corn, beans, and squash, known as the Three Sisters, became the cornerstone of their diet. This agricultural base supported larger villages and allowed for more complex social and political structures. Corn was more than food. It became woven into ritual, identity, and seasonal cycles of life. Planting, cultivating, and harvesting were guided not just by practical needs, but by ceremonial practices that reinforced the interconnectedness of community and nature. By the time European explorers first entered the southeast, the Cherokee were already a powerful and established people with a deep history behind them. But to understand their later struggles and adaptations, it is necessary to appreciate the longevity of their presence in Appalachia. These were not newcomers to the land, but people who had lived upon it, shaped it, and been shaped by it for countless generations. Their identity was inseparable from mountain ridges, river valleys, and fertile plains. The memory of ancestors was embedded in burial mounds, sacred caves, and the very paths worn into the earth by centuries of travel. Archaeological sites across the region reveal the evolution of Cherokee material culture. Pottery styles shifted from simple cord-mark designs to more elaborate stamped patterns. Tools crafted from stone, bone, and shell reveal a people skilled in adapting their environment to meet their needs. Trade networks carried materials such as mica, copper, and marine shells from distant regions, showing that Cherokee communities were not isolated but part of a far-reaching web of exchange stretching across the continent. These networks not only provided material goods, but also ideas, stories, and influences that were absorbed and reshaped into the Cherokee cultural fabric. The early history of the Cherokee cannot be separated from the larger story of the Mississippian cultural tradition. Across the southeast, mound-building societies flourished between the 9th and 16th centuries, creating large ceremonial centres with impressive earthen mounds that served as platforms for temples and elite residences. While not every Cherokee community participated in mound building to the same extent as their neighbours, the influence of this tradition is visible in their ceremonial life and political organisation. Some of the great mound sites, such as those at Etowah and Kittua, are remembered in Cherokee oral tradition as ancestral places, connecting their people to the broader southeastern cultural landscape. As centuries passed, the Cherokee developed a clear sense of territorial boundaries, though these were understood more as fluid zones of influence rather than fixed lines. Their homeland stretched across the Blue Ridge and Smoky Mountains into the river valleys below. Within this territory they maintained hunting grounds, farming plots, and sacred sites. Seasonal movements were common, with families shifting between summer and winter settlements, depending on agricultural needs and climate. This rhythm of life created a deep familiarity with the land and reinforced the collective identity that was tied to it. What set the Cherokee apart was not only their endurance in the region, but also their ability to adapt. The arrival of maize agriculture, the rise of complex village structures, and the integration of trade networks were all embraced without losing the core of their identity. They maintained continuity while adjusting to change, a pattern that would define their story in centuries to come. When later confronted with colonial expansion, forced removal, and cultural upheaval, this resilience would again come to the forefront, but its roots were already present in the earliest days of their history. To look at the Cherokee origins is to see a people whose story is inseparable from their environment. The mountains, forests, and rivers were not just backdrops, but active participants in shaping identity. Every ridge held memory, every river carried meaning, and every plant or animal was part of a web of existence that the Cherokee respected and depended upon. Their beginnings in ancient Appalachia were not just about survival. They were about creating a way of life that was sustainable, balanced, and deeply meaningful. From these origins, the path forward would lead into the formation of myths and sacred stories that preserved their understanding of the world, carrying the lessons of ancestors into the generations that followed. Among the Cherokee, the understanding of where life began and how the world was formed was never confined to dusty explanations or cold logic. It lived inside stories, told and retold around fires, carried in the voices of elders, and woven into the rhythm of daily life. These stories were not entertainment alone, but carried the weight of instruction, warning, and connection. They placed every listener in a vast continuum of existence, making clear that humans were not isolated beings, but part of a greater balance, shaped by forces older and larger than themselves. The Cherokee creation story begins before the earth itself was firm, when everything existed as water stretching endlessly in all directions. There was no land to stand on, only a watery expanse, and above it the animals and spirits lived together in a sky world. Life in this upper realm was stable, but curiosity and necessity led the beings to look downward. They wondered what lay beneath, what rested under the waters, and how it might be possible to reach it. It was then that water beetle, a small and often overlooked creature, offered its service. Diving bravely into the depths, water beetle churned through the endless waters and returned with a mouthful of soft mud. This mud, brought up from the mysterious bottom, spread and grew until it formed land, which slowly expanded into the earth itself. The new earth, however, was soft and unsteady. To dry it, the great buzzard was sent down from the sky. As it flapped its immense wings over the wet surface, valleys and mountains took shape. Where its wings struck down, the land dipped into valleys. Where they rose up, the earth formed into mountains. In this way, the familiar ridges and hollows of the Cherokee homeland were explained, not as chance formations, but as the marks of an ancient bird whose labour gave shape to the world. This land, once firm, was suspended from the sky by 4 cords that stretched outward to the cardinal directions. Though unseen, these cords kept the earth balanced, a reminder that creation itself was fragile and that balance must be maintained. To the Cherokee, this detail was not simply metaphorical but practical. It reflected their broader belief that harmony, if broken, could bring disaster, and that human life depended upon maintaining the order set in the beginning. With land formed, the animals came down to explore it. In the stories, they found the new world beautiful, but not yet fit for their needs. The sun was too close, and its heat threatened to burn them. They pushed the sun higher into the sky, first to a safe distance, and then further, until it rested in the position that would allow crops to grow and the seasons to turn. To explain the cycle of day and night, the Cherokee told how the sun moves along a path guided by the will of the spirits, ensuring that light and darkness alternate in a steady rhythm. In the new earth, plants began to grow, and animals spread across the valleys and forests. Yet the relationship between humans, animals, and plants was not one of separation. In the Cherokee sacred stories, animals once spoke as people do, reasoning, debating, and making decisions. When humans later appeared, the animals noticed how destructive they could be, taking more than needed, wasting what they killed. In response, the animals gathered in council and decided to bring sickness upon humans as punishment for their disrespect. Wolves declared that if humans killed them without necessity, their numbers would retaliate. Deer warned that those who took them wastefully would suffer from rheumatism. In this way, illness was explained as a direct consequence of imbalance between humans and animals. Yet plants, seeing this, chose compassion. They met in their own council and resolved that for every disease that animals created, a plant would exist to cure it. Thus, within Cherokee belief, every plant carried a purpose, either to heal or to nourish, and part of human responsibility was to learn these properties and use them wisely. This balance between punishment and healing underscored a truth that the Cherokee carried into every generation. Harmony must be respected, for imbalance brings suffering, and yet compassion remains available if humans live with humility. Among the most enduring sacred stories is the tale of Kanati and Selu, the first man and the first woman. Kanati, whose name means the lucky hunter, always returned from the hunt with game. Selu, meaning corn, always produced food from her basket. Together they lived with their son and another boy, Wild Boy, who appeared mysteriously and became part of their family. Suspicious of their parents' powers, the boys followed Kanati one day and discovered that his hunting success came not from chance, but from a cave filled with game animals that he carefully released as needed. Defying his instructions, the boys opened the cave recklessly, and the animals fled in every direction, filling the forests and fields but no longer easily caught. The boys also spied on Selu, and saw that she produced corn and beans by rubbing her stomach and sides. Disturbed by this, they accused her of witchcraft and plotted against her. Realizing what was to come, Selu accepted her fate but gave instructions before her death. She told the boys to clear a patch of land and drag her body around it 7 times, then stay up all night and watch. They only completed part of her instructions, and from this incomplete act came the first crops of corn and beans. Through this story, the Cherokee explained both the origin of their staple foods and the reason why agriculture requires labour and vigilance. Corn was not simply a crop, it was a gift from Selu, bound forever to her sacrifice. These stories were not locked away in ritual settings, but infused into the rhythm of Cherokee life. Children learned them at night by the fire, hunters recalled them while preparing for the chase, and healers carried their lessons into the practice of medicine. The creation stories were memory and instruction at once, making clear that the land was sacred, that food came from sacrifice, and that balance between all living things was fragile and must be guarded. Over generations, more tales grew around the animals, plants, and spirits of the land. Rabbit became a trickster figure, clever and mischievous, always finding ways to outwit stronger animals or sometimes falling victim to his own schemes. The bear carried meanings of strength and medicine, while birds often acted as messengers between realms. These stories not only explained the natural world but also provided moral lessons. They taught about greed, generosity, cleverness, foolishness, and the importance of respecting limits. Oral tradition ensured that these stories were never told the same way twice. Each storyteller adapted details to the audience, the setting, or the lesson at hand. What remained constant was their function, to connect listeners to the origins of their people, to the natural world, and to the responsibilities that came with life. In this way, the stories were living, not static, always growing and reshaping with each telling. As outsiders began to encounter the Cherokee, these sacred stories were among the first elements of culture to be misunderstood or dismissed. Missionaries often viewed them as superstition, and anthropologists sometimes recorded them as curiosities without grasping their depth. Yet for the Cherokee themselves, the stories never ceased to matter. They anchored identity through upheaval, reminding the people of their roots when everything else seemed in danger of being lost. In the modern era, these stories remain central. Elders continue to pass them to younger generations, both in traditional settings and through new forms such as books, recordings, and community gatherings. The myths of creation are not relics, but active parts of Cherokee identity, carrying lessons as relevant today as they were centuries ago. They remind listeners that the earth is fragile, that balance must be respected, and that life itself comes from sacrifice and responsibility. The Cherokee myths and sacred stories form a bridge between the origins of their people and the lived reality of their ancestors. From the creation of land out of water to the gifts of corn and the lessons of the animals, they establish the foundation upon which all later history rests. To move forward into the story of the Cherokee is to carry these teachings as constant reference points, shaping how the people saw themselves, how they treated the land, and how they faced the challenges that lay ahead. The myths did not end with Selu's sacrifice or the animals' councils. They continued to grow into the stories of early traditions, where ceremonial practices and woodland lifeways would further define the Cherokee world. When the story of the Cherokee is carried backward into the depths of time, it meets the long arc of woodland traditions that stretched across the eastern woodlands of North America. These traditions began to take shape around 1000 BCE and lasted for more than a millennium, leaving behind not only material evidence but also patterns of life and culture that shaped what would become Cherokee society. The early woodland period did not represent a sudden invention of new ways, but rather a slow layering of change, as older hunting and gathering practices blended with innovations in pottery, agriculture, and settlement. In the valleys and ridges of the Appalachians, the ancestors of the Cherokee lived in scattered hamlets, each made up of a few extended families. These communities were not isolated but linked by kinship ties and exchange networks, so that even small groups remained part of a larger social fabric. Daily life revolved around the rhythms of the seasons. In spring, families planted small gardens with squash, gourds, and native plants like maygrass, knotweed, and chenopodium. Summer brought foraging for berries, nuts, and greens, while fall demanded preparation for the cold months ahead, with food dried, smoked, or stored in pits lined with clay and bark. Winter was a time for storytelling and ritual, when the long nights were filled with tales of origins and lessons carried forward from generation to generation. Pottery was one of the defining features of this period. Before its appearance, food was cooked in stone or woven containers, but clay vessels transformed daily life. Thick-walled pots with simple cord-mark designs were durable and useful, allowing families to store seeds, stew food, and carry water more effectively. Archaeologists trace stylistic differences across regions, but in the Cherokee homelands, pottery quickly became an essential tool. Women were the primary potters, shaping clay with practiced hands, smoothing and firing it in open hearths. Each vessel was both functional and expressive, carrying the imprint of the maker and the community it served. Burial practices also began to change during this time. Earlier traditions of scattered or informal interments gave way to more organised burial grounds, sometimes marked with small mounds of earth. These early mounds were not the great ceremonial earthworks that would come later, but smaller, localised expressions of respect for the dead. Within them, archaeologists find pottery, stone tools and ornaments, suggesting that people believed in a continuation of life beyond death. To place goods with the deceased was to acknowledge a journey, one that required companionship and provision. The early woodland period also marked the expansion of trade networks. Even in the remote valleys of the southern Appalachians, materials such as copper, marine shells, and exotic stones made their way from distant places. These goods were not merely decorative but carried social and spiritual value. A copper ornament worn in a ceremony, a shell gorgie carved with symbolic patterns, or a carefully shaped blade of non-local stone all spoke of connections that stretched beyond the horizon. These networks did not erase local identities but enriched them, tying communities into a continental web of exchange. Ritual life during this time is more difficult to reconstruct, but evidence points to a growing emphasis on communal gatherings and sacred practices. Hearths found in central locations, larger than those needed for family use, suggest fires that burned for entire communities. Ritual feasting likely marked seasonal transitions, with foods prepared in large pots and shared among many. The fire itself was more than heat and light. It embodied the presence of the sacred, a theme that would remain central to Cherokee life for centuries to come. The early woodland peoples of the Appalachians were not static or isolated. They were innovators, adopting new crops and technologies, yet they remained deeply tied to their environment. Rivers served as highways, carrying canoes and goods between villages. Trails wound through forests, connecting settlements across ridges and valleys. Every path was familiar. Every river bend carried memory, and every clearing in the forest was potential ground for planting. The role of clan and kinship began to solidify in this era as well. While full documentation comes from the later centuries, its foundations can be seen in woodland traditions. Extended families lived close together, sharing labour and responsibility. Decisions were made communally, and leadership was based not on dominance, but on consensus and respect. Elders carried authority through wisdom, while skilled hunters and knowledgeable healers earned trust by their deeds. The seeds of the later Cherokee clan system were already present, ensuring social cohesion and a sense of belonging that extended beyond the individual. As centuries passed, the reliance on cultivated plants increased. While hunting and foraging continued to provide essential resources, gardens grew larger and maize began to make its first appearance. It arrived slowly, carried northward from Mexico through long chains of exchange, but by the end of the early woodland period, small amounts of corn were being planted in Cherokee homelands. At first it was supplemental, a crop grown alongside native plants and gathered foods. Over time, however, it would rise to prominence, reshaping settlement patterns and ceremonial life. The expansion of agriculture had consequences. Larger, more permanent villages developed, and populations began to grow. Storage pits multiplied, and pottery forms became more specialized. Social structures became more complex, with roles for leaders, ritual specialists, and craft workers. This increasing complexity set the stage for the Middle and Late Woodland periods, when mound building and elaborate ceremonial centers would dominate the landscape. For the Cherokee, these changes represented continuity as much as transformation, as the traditions of their ancestors blended into new forms suited to changing circumstances. The archaeological record shows not only what people built or buried, but also how they adapted to challenges. Shifts in climate, floods, droughts, and resource fluctuations all required resilience. The ancestors of the Cherokee met these challenges not by abandoning their traditions, but by adjusting them. A failed harvest could be offset by intensified hunting. A shortage of game might encourage greater reliance on stored crops. Flexibility was key, and this trait would later define Cherokee survival in times of upheaval. It is important to remember that the early woodland traditions were not background or prelude, but part of the lived reality of Cherokee ancestors. The houses they built, the pots they fired, the trails they walked, and the stories they told all form the foundation of a cultural identity that endured for millennia. To sit by their fires would have been to hear the same kinds of stories later told in Cherokee towns, to watch children play as they imitated the tasks of their elders, and to feel the rhythm of life ordered by the seasons. As the early woodland period gave way to later developments, continuity remained as important as change. The sacred fire, the reliance on community, the respect for balance, and the connection to land all carried forward. These traditions would be reshaped and expanded in the centuries to come, but they never disappeared. They became the threads woven into the broader fabric of Cherokee culture, threads that could still be traced even in the face of profound transformations. From the villages of the early woodland era grew the towns and mound cultures that would dominate the southeastern landscape. In those later centuries, ceremonial centers rose, political systems matured, and trade networks expanded further. But the foundations were already laid in the lives of those who built small hamlets, tended early gardens, shaped clay into vessels, and told stories by firelight under the ridges of Appalachia. As generations passed, the communities of the Cherokee homelands grew larger and more interconnected, evolving from scattered hamlets into organized towns that stood as centers of life, trade, and ceremony. The shift did not happen all at once. It was the result of centuries of gradual change. As agriculture spread, populations increased, and the traditions of the woodland peoples merged into what archaeologists call the Mississippian cultural world. Across the southeast, the land began to fill with towns marked by earthen mounds, ceremonial plazas, and fortified palisades. For the ancestors of the Cherokee, these developments shaped their society in ways that endured long after the mounds themselves had ceased to rise. The construction of mounds was one of the most visible expressions of this transformation. Built from basket after basket of earth carried by hand, these mounds were not casual features but monumental efforts requiring the cooperation of entire communities. Some stood as flat-topped platforms, supporting temples, council houses, or the residences of leaders. Others were burial mounds, layered carefully with soil, ash, and offerings to honour the dead. Their presence announced both power and sacred purpose, visible from afar as symbols of community identity and cosmic order. At sites across the southeast, from Etowah in Georgia to Cahokia near the Mississippi, mound cultures flourished between the 9th and 16th centuries. In the Cherokee homelands, towns such as Kittiwah carried this tradition forward. Known in oral history as the mother town of the Cherokee, Kittiwah held a central mound that symbolized not only political authority, but also spiritual connection. Around such centers, plazas provided space for gatherings, dances, games, and councils. Life was no longer confined to small family groups, but was woven into the fabric of larger communities bound together by ritual and leadership. The rise of towns transformed daily life. Homes of wattle and daub clustered around central plazas, each family contributing to the collective rhythm of community. Fields of corn, beans, and squash spread outward, tended by women whose agricultural labour sustained the towns. Men hunted deer, bear, and turkey in the forests, bringing back meat and hides that complemented the harvest. Pottery grew more elaborate, with stamped designs reflecting not only functional needs but also artistic expression. Stone tools were refined, shell ornaments carved, and copper worked into shapes that carried ceremonial meaning. Leadership in these towns took on new forms. Instead of small councils of elders alone, communities began to recognise more centralised figures, often referred to in English as chiefs. These leaders, however, were not absolute rulers but consensus builders, mediators between the spiritual and physical worlds, and representatives of the town in broader networks of alliance. Their authority rested not only on lineage but also on their ability to maintain harmony, ensure successful rituals, and manage the redistribution of goods during feasts and ceremonies. The sacred fire, which had long been a symbol of balance and continuity, gained new prominence in this era. At the heart of each town, a central fire burned within the council house or temple, representing the life of the community itself. It was tended with care, never allowed to go out, for its extinguishing would symbolize disruption and imbalance. The fire connected the town to the cosmos, linking the four directions and the cycles of sun and moon. Around it, decisions were made, stories told, and rituals performed. Mound towns were not isolated but connected through far-reaching exchange networks. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, and chert from distant quarries all found their way into Cherokee lands. These materials carried more than economic value. They were woven into ritual life, used in burials, ceremonies, and symbols of status. The presence of exotic goods in mound centres demonstrated both the reach of trade and the importance of connection, tying local communities into a larger world that stretched across the continent. The rise of towns also meant an expansion of ceremonial life. Dances, feasts, and seasonal rituals became collective affairs, involving hundreds rather than dozens of participants. The green corn ceremony in particular emerged as a central ritual, marking the renewal of life, the forgiveness of offences, and the reaffirmation of balance. At such ceremonies, fires were extinguished and rekindled, symbolising both destruction and renewal, a reminder that even as crops were harvested and consumed, the cycle of life would begin again. Games and competitions, such as the ball game, later known as stickball, also played a vital role in town life. More than sport, these contests carried ritual significance, serving as substitutes for conflict, means of divination, and occasions for community bonding. Entire towns gathered to watch, cheer, and wager on the outcome, while players trained and competed with seriousness equal to that of warriors. Through these events, towns maintained cohesion, celebrated vitality, and reinforced the bonds that held communities together. Conflict, however, was not absent from this world. Fortifications around towns suggest that warfare was a reality, whether from rival groups, competition for resources, or the pressures of expanding populations. Wooden palisades surrounded some mound centres, with bastions allowing defenders to repel attackers. Warfare in this era was not only physical but spiritual, with rituals accompanying both preparation and aftermath. Victory and defeat alike carried consequences that extended into the realm of balance, requiring purification and renewal to restore harmony. Burial practices during the Mound era grew more elaborate. High-status individuals were often interred within or near mounds, accompanied by goods that spoke of their role in life and their journey in death. Shell gorgets carved with spirals, circles, and animal motifs adorned the deceased, while copper ornaments gleamed as symbols of both wealth and power. These burials reflected not only individual status, but also community investment in maintaining cosmic order, ensuring that leaders and ancestors continued to play their roles even beyond death. Oral traditions preserved by the Cherokee recall these mound centers not as distant curiosities, but as living places of origin and memory. Kituwa, for example, is remembered as the birthplace of the Cherokee people, the place where the sacred fire was first lit and from which it spread to other towns. Even after centuries of upheaval, forced removals and loss of land, Kituwa remained a touchstone of identity, demonstrating the enduring power of these early towns in shaping cultural memory. The rise of towns and mound cultures also influenced gender roles and social organisation. Women, as the cultivators of corn and keepers of agricultural cycles, held significant authority in matters of land and family. Lineage was traced through the mother's side, ensuring that property and clan identity passed through women. Men, while hunters and warriors, depended on the agricultural surplus provided by women to sustain both families and ceremonies. This balance between genders reflected the broader balance cherished in Cherokee worldview, one that recognized distinct roles yet bound them together in mutual dependence. As mound towns thrived, they also adapted to changing circumstances. Climate fluctuations, shifts in trade routes, and pressures from neighbouring groups all required resilience. Some towns were abandoned, others expanded, and new ones rose in their place. The pattern was never static but dynamic, reflecting both continuity and transformation. The knowledge of how to build, sustain, and renew towns was passed from generation to generation, ensuring that even as individual places changed, the broader tradition endured. By the time Europeans first entered the southeast, many of the great mound centres had declined, their fires extinguished and their plazas quiet. Yet the memory of those towns remained alive in Cherokee culture, not only in oral stories, but in the continued emphasis on community, ceremony, and balance. The Cherokee towns encountered by explorers were not identical to the great mound centres of earlier centuries, but they carried forward the essence of that world, shaped by centuries of experience in organising life around sacred fires, communal rituals, and connections to the land. To understand the Cherokee as Europeans first described them is to see the legacy of the mound era still present. The towns they lived in, the ceremonies they performed, the authority of their leaders, and the balance between agriculture and hunting all bore the imprint of that long tradition. The rise of towns and mound cultures was not a brief chapter, but a foundation that shaped everything that followed, embedding in Cherokee society the principles of balance, community, and continuity that would guide them into the challenges of the colonial era and beyond. The transition from mound centres into later towns did not erase the past, but carried it forward. As colonial contact reshaped the landscape, as alliances and conflicts multiplied, and as new pressures emerged, the Cherokee would continue to draw upon the lessons of their ancestors who had built mounds, tended fires, and sustained communities through centuries of change. The story of towns and mound cultures thus leads directly into the continued development of Cherokee language, oral legacy, and cultural identity, elements that would deepen and expand as their history unfolded. The identity of the Cherokee has always been carried not only in their towns, ceremonies, and traditions, but most profoundly in their language. More than words, it is a vessel for memory, history, humour, teaching, and spirituality. To speak Cherokee is to frame the world in a certain way, to recognise relationships between beings, to name the land in ways that tie it to stories and ancestors. Long before written symbols appeared, the Cherokee language was the archive of their people, and oral tradition was the means by which that archive lived and grew across generations. Cherokee belongs to the Iroquoian language family, a connection that links the people of the Appalachians to those further north, such as the Haudenosaunee and the Huron. Linguists trace this shared ancestry through patterns in grammar, vocabulary and sound. But despite the link, the Cherokee tongue developed independently for centuries, creating a unique system unlike any other in the southeast. Its sound is marked by a rhythm that is distinct, shaped by a reliance on syllables rather than single consonant clusters, and its grammar organises reality in ways unfamiliar to speakers of European languages. In Cherokee, verbs are central, carrying far more information than in English, with subject, object, tense, aspect, and even relational detail embedded within a single word. This complexity reflects a worldview in which actions, relationships, and context matter as much as objects themselves. A verb might describe not only what happens, but who participates, how many are involved, when it occurs, and whether it is ongoing or complete. Such richness allows speakers to convey layers of meaning compactly, but it also means that to understand Cherokee is to understand a way of seeing the world that is deeply relational. Words are never simply labels. They're reflections of the interconnected web of life. Place names in Cherokee reveal this connection vividly. Rivers, mountains, and valleys are not just geographic features but living parts of cultural memory. A name can recall an event, a sacred story, or a characteristic of the land that carries meaning beyond physical description. To say the name is to call forth that memory, to place oneself within a continuum of history tied to that location. Even today, maps across the southeast are dotted with Cherokee names, though many have been altered or anglicised, fragments of a linguistic legacy that endures despite centuries of disruption. Oral tradition carried the language into every part of life. Stories were told not only for entertainment but for instruction, shaping the moral framework of children and reinforcing the responsibilities of adults. Around fires in the evenings, elders recited the tales of creation, the adventures of Rabbit, the lessons of Kanati and Selu, and the teachings of the animals. These stories explain the origins of illness and healing, the reasons for rituals, and the importance of balance. Each telling was an act of renewal, ensuring that memory did not fade, and that young people understood their place in the community and the cosmos. The oral legacy extended beyond myth into history. Important events such as wars, migrations, alliances, and calamities were remembered in stories passed down from one generation to the next. These accounts were not written on paper but etched into collective memory through repeated telling. Skilled orators served as historians, their memories reinforced by communal participation. When an elder recited the story of a battle or treaty, others in the circle might add detail, correct a sequence, or elaborate on an episode, creating a collaborative memory that was both resilient and flexible. Songs and chants formed another essential layer of the oral tradition. Rituals were accompanied by words sung in rhythms that reinforced their power. Healing ceremonies relied on precise chants, often handed down within specific families or lineages of medicine people. The words themselves carried sacred force, believed to activate the healing power of plants, fire, or water. Without the language, the ritual would lose its effectiveness, for it was not only the physical act that mattered, but the verbal invocation that bound it to spiritual power. Public speech was also a respected art. Council meetings demanded eloquence, with leaders expected to persuade, advise and mediate through careful use of language. Words were chosen with precision, and the ability to speak well was a mark of wisdom and authority. Silence, too, carried weight, for pauses signalled respect, consideration and gravity. In such settings, the spoken word was not casual but deliberate, binding agreements and shaping decisions that affected entire communities. Humour had its place as well. Cherokee oral tradition did not consist solely of solemn myths and speeches, but also playful tales, witty remarks, and jokes that kept gatherings lively. Rabbit stories, often humorous, illustrated the folly of arrogance or the cleverness of wit. Humour served as both relief and teaching tool, a way to diffuse tension, to correct behaviour without harshness, and to keep oral tradition engaging for listeners young and old. Through this oral world, the Cherokee language thrived for centuries without writing. Yet its survival depended on constant use, on the rhythm of daily life. Children learned it by listening to parents and grandparents, by joining in games, by helping in gardens and hunts where instructions and stories mingled. The language lived not in classrooms or books, but in kitchens, fields, forests, and council houses. To be Cherokee was to live in Cherokee words. The arrival of European settlers brought profound challenges to this system. Missionaries, traders, and officials introduced English and sought to replace Cherokee stories with Christian teachings. Written treaties demanded signatures, a form foreign to oral agreements. Yet even in this period of upheaval, the oral legacy proved resilient. Elders continued to tell stories, healers continued to chant, and councils continued to deliberate in Cherokee. The language remained the foundation of identity, even as new pressures mounted. In the early 19th century, the most dramatic shift occurred with the invention of the Cherokee syllabary by Sequoyah. For the first time, Cherokee words could be written with a system of characters unique to their language. This innovation did not erase the oral legacy, but expanded it, creating a bridge between spoken tradition and written record. Sacred stories, songs, and speeches that had lived only in memory could now be recorded and shared across distances. The oral world remained vibrant, but now it had a companion in writing, allowing the language to survive even as external forces sought to suppress it. The preservation of oral tradition was not only about memory but about resilience. Even during the forced removal known as the Trail of Tears, when thousands of Cherokee were uprooted from their homelands and made to march west, stories travelled with them. Around campfires along the route, elders continued to speak in Cherokee, telling the same myths and histories that had sustained their people for centuries. Language provided continuity when the land was taken, a thread that bound the displaced community together. In the modern era, Cherokee oral tradition faces challenges from declining numbers of fluent speakers and the dominance of English in daily life. Yet it persists, carried by elders, cultural programs, and communities dedicated to revitalization. Storytelling festivals, language immersion schools, and recordings of songs and chants all work to ensure that the oral legacy does not fade. More than preservation, these efforts represent continuity, keeping alive a way of speaking and remembering that has defined the Cherokee since their beginnings. To hear Cherokee spoken is to encounter not only words but an entire worldview. It is to step into a system of thought where verbs define relationships, where place names embody history, where stories bind people to land and to each other. The oral legacy is not a relic of the past, but a living tradition that continues to shape identity. It carries the lessons of the ancestors into the present, reminding each generation of their responsibilities and their place in the balance of life. As the story of the Cherokee unfolds further, the language and oral tradition remain at its heart. The rituals, the myths, the speeches, the chants, all of these form the bedrock upon which later struggles and adaptations rest. From this foundation, the Cherokee would continue to maintain their social order, their clan system, and their spiritual beliefs, carrying forward the essence of who they are even through times of upheaval. Finally, the Wild Potato Clan was tied to agriculture and the gathering of edible plants, ensuring that food and sustenance were never neglected. Membership in these clans was inherited through the mother. A child belonged to the mother's clan, and this matrilineal structure gave women central importance in the continuity of Cherokee society. Lineage, property, and identity flowed through women, creating a balance of power that differed sharply from the patriarchal systems of Europeans who later encountered them. Women held authority not only in domestic life but also in the governance of clans. for the clan mothers had the power to select and depose chiefs. This ensured that leadership was never a matter of unchecked ambition, but remained accountable to the community through female oversight. Marriage was regulated by the clan system. Individuals were forbidden from marrying within their own clan, for to do so would be considered incestuous, since clan members were regarded as close kin regardless of blood ties. Instead, marriages had to occur across clans, weaving families together and preventing isolation or internal conflict. This rule reinforced the interconnectedness of Cherokee society, ensuring that no clan stood apart from others. Through marriage, alliances were constantly renewed, binding the entire community in a web of kinship. Clan affiliation extended into law and justice. If a member of one clan harmed someone from another, responsibility for the offence fell upon the entire clan, not just the individual. Retribution, reconciliation, or compensation was carried out through the clan system, preventing personal feuds from spiralling into endless conflict. For example, if a murder occurred, the victim's clan had the right to demand justice, which might involve the execution of the offender or another member of their clan. This collective accountability ensured that responsibility was never evaded and that disputes were resolved within the broader framework of balance. Ceremonial responsibilities were also divided among clans. Certain clans produced medicine people, others dancers or singers for rituals, and still others caretakers of sacred traditions. This distribution of duties prevented any single group from dominating ritual life and reinforced the interdependence of the community. The clan system was not merely social organisation but spiritual as well, reflecting the belief that harmony came from the balance of diverse roles. The matrilineal structure gave women a respected and powerful role in society. Clan mothers were not symbolic figures, but practical leaders, guiding decisions about land, family and leadership. In councils, women's voices were heard alongside men's, and their authority in choosing chiefs gave them a direct role in governance. At the same time, women's work in agriculture was recognised as central to survival, for it was the harvest of corn, beans and squash that sustained towns. Men's roles as hunters and warriors were valued, but they depended on the agricultural surplus provided by women. This balance between genders reflected the broader philosophy of harmony, where no role was lesser, but each was necessary. Children were raised not only by parents, but by the extended clan. A child's uncles and aunts were considered equally responsible for guidance, discipline, and instruction. In fact, a boy's maternal uncle often played a greater role in his upbringing than his father, teaching him the skills of hunting, warfare, and tradition. This ensured that children always had multiple sources of support and instruction, reinforcing the communal nature of Cherokee life. The clan system extended beyond individual towns, linking the wider Cherokee nation together. When representatives gathered from different communities, their identities were recognized not only by town but by clan, creating a shared framework that transcended distance. In times of conflict or alliance, clan ties provided a means of negotiation and reconciliation, for even strangers could identify themselves as kin through shared clan membership. This system gave the Cherokee a cohesion that was not dependent on centralized government but on the deep-rooted bonds of kinship. Oral tradition preserved the origins of the clans, explaining their symbolic roles through stories that were passed down through generations. These tales gave meaning to the distinctions between clans, reminding people that their identities carried responsibilities as well as privileges. To belong to the Wolf clan was not only to inherit a name, but to embody the protective spirit of the wolf. To belong to the Paint clan was to carry knowledge of healing that had been entrusted to ancestors. These stories reinforced the sacred nature of the clan system, making it more than social structure. It was a spiritual inheritance. Even in warfare, the clan system shaped conduct. Warriors identified themselves through clan affiliation, and victories or losses were shared collectively. Captives taken in war could be adopted into a clan, giving them a place in society and transforming enemies into kin. This practice of adoption reflected the flexibility of the clan system, which could expand to include outsiders, ensuring that social cohesion remained strong even in times of upheaval. As Europeans began to intrude upon Cherokee lands, the clan system faced challenges but also proved resilient. Missionaries and colonial officials often misunderstood its matrilineal nature, assuming men were the sole decision-makers. Yet women continued to exercise authority, especially in matters of land and governance. Oral tradition preserved the origins of the clans, explaining their symbolic roles through stories that were passed down through generations. These tales gave meaning to the distinctions between clans, reminding people that their identities carried responsibilities as well as privileges. To belong to the wolf clan was not only to inherit a name, but to embody the protective spirit of the wolf. To belong to the Paint clan was to carry knowledge of healing that had been entrusted to ancestors. These stories reinforced the sacred nature of the clan system, making it more than social structure. It was a spiritual inheritance. Even in warfare, the clan system shaped conduct. Warriors identified themselves through clan affiliation, and victories or losses were shared collectively. Captives taken in war could be adopted into a clan, giving them a place in society and transforming enemies into kin. This practice of adoption reflected the flexibility of the clan system, which could expand to include outsiders, ensuring that social cohesion remained strong even in times of upheaval. As Europeans began to intrude upon Cherokee lands, the clan system faced challenges but also proved resilient. Missionaries and colonial officials often misunderstood its matrilineal nature, assuming men were the sole decision-makers. Yet women continued to exercise authority, especially in matters of land and governance. The prohibition of marriage within clans remained strong, even when outsiders sought to impose their own customs. The justice system based on clan accountability persisted alongside new pressures, demonstrating the durability of the structure. The clan system was more than an internal framework. It was a source of strength in negotiating with outsiders. Chiefs chosen with the approval of clan mothers could claim legitimate authority, and the ability of clans to act collectively gave the Cherokee leverage in dealings with colonial governments. At the same time, the system allowed for internal diversity of opinion, for clans might take different stances on issues, leading to debates and compromises that reflected the democratic spirit of Cherokee councils. The continuity of the clan system across centuries demonstrates its central importance. Even after forced removal to Indian territory, the system persisted, providing structure and identity in a new land. Displacement could not erase matrilineal descent, clan responsibilities, or the authority of clan mothers. In fact, the clan system became a vital means of survival, ensuring that social bonds remained intact even when geographic bonds were severed. In the modern era, clan identity continues to be recognized among the Cherokee, though its roles have adapted to new circumstances. Ceremonial duties, social responsibilities, and kinship rules still reflect the old patterns, while new forms of governance coexist with the traditional structure. For many, identifying with a clan remains a matter of pride and continuity, a link to ancestors, and an affirmation of cultural survival. The clan system and social order of the Cherokee reveal a society built on balance, accountability, and interdependence. Every individual belonged to something greater, every family tied into a web of kinship that ensured cohesion. This framework sustained the Cherokee through centuries of change, providing both stability and adaptability. It was not an inflexible hierarchy, but a living system, capable of expansion, negotiation, and renewal. From the clan system emerged a worldview that valued balance between genders, responsibility to community, and continuity through matrilineal descent. These principles shaped not only domestic life, but also political organization, spiritual practice, and relations with outsiders. The story of the Cherokee cannot be told without the clans, for they were the foundation upon which every other aspect of culture was built. The strength of this system carried forward into the ways the Cherokee approached their spiritual beliefs, the rituals they performed, and the sacred fire that burned at the centre of their towns. As remembered in sacred stories, when humans became careless hunters, the animals brought disease upon them. In response, the plants offered remedies to restore balance. This belief gave rise to a deep respect for the natural world. Hunters performed rituals before and after killing game, offering thanks and ensuring that no part of the animal was wasted. Healers spoke chants to call upon the plant's healing power. Farmers planted and harvested with ceremonies that acknowledged the sacrifice of corn and beans. To live without respect for these relationships was to invite imbalance, and imbalance meant suffering. The sacred fire embodied this worldview. Every Cherokee town maintained a central fire, tended with great care, kept burning through all seasons. It was not simply a hearth, but the living heart of the community. Its flames represented purity, renewal, and connection to the Creator. To approach it was to stand at the meeting place of human and spiritual realms. The fire was kindled with specific rituals, often using 4 logs arranged in a cross pattern to reflect the 4 cardinal directions. When the flames rose, they were understood to reach beyond the human world, linking the town to the cosmic order. During the green corn ceremony, the most important ritual of the Cherokee year, the sacred fire was extinguished and rekindled. This act symbolized the destruction of impurities and the renewal of life. Families put out their own household fires and took new flames from the central fire, binding the community together in unity. The ceremony marked forgiveness, cleansing, and the beginning of a new cycle, with fresh corn eaten in celebration. Without the fire, the ceremony could not occur, for it was the fire that ensured the renewal was complete. Purification rituals often involved water as well. Rivers and streams were considered sacred places where balance could be restored. Immersion in running water cleansed both body and spirit, removing impurities and preparing participants for ceremony. This practice tied the people to the cycles of the natural world, for water, like fire, was a force that flowed between realms. Together, fire and water embodied the balance of opposites, each necessary for harmony. Ceremonial specialists, often referred to as medicine people, held deep knowledge of the rituals, chants, and medicines required to maintain balance. Their role was not limited to curing physical illness, but extended to restoring harmony in the spiritual realm. They knew which plants cured which diseases, which chants accompanied their use, and which taboos must be observed. Their authority came not from personal ambition, but from knowledge handed down through families, apprenticeships, and visions. To misuse such knowledge was dangerous, for it could unleash imbalance instead of healing it. The Cherokee also believed in powerful spiritual beings that shaped the world and influenced human life. Some were beneficent, guiding and protecting the people, while others were dangerous, testing their discipline and respect. The thunder beings, for example, were considered guardians who brought rain and punished wrongdoing with storms. Little people, small spiritual figures living in forests and caves, were mysterious helpers who could aid or mislead humans depending on how they were treated. To dismiss these beings as mere fantasy was unthinkable. They were woven into daily experience, shaping how people acted and how they interpreted events. Spiritual beliefs guided conduct not only in rituals but in ordinary actions. Certain foods were avoided at specific times, certain words left unspoken, certain acts performed only under the right conditions. Pregnant women followed taboos to protect the unborn child. Warriors observed purification before and after battle to prevent imbalance. Hunters fasted or prayed before going into the forest. These practices were not superstition but discipline, part of the responsibility of living within a balanced world. The sacred fire served as the focal point for political as well as spiritual life. Council houses built around or above the fire were the places where leaders gathered. Disputes were resolved, and decisions were made. The fire witnessed every agreement giving it sacred weight. When people entered council, they did so in the presence of the fire, ensuring that their words and decisions were bound to the balance it represented. This fusion of the sacred and political reinforced the principle that governance was not separate from spirituality but an extension of it. Festivals and dances reinforced these beliefs throughout the year. Seasonal ceremonies marked planting, hunting, and harvest, each tied to the cycles of nature and the renewal of harmony. Dances were not simply entertainment but forms of prayer, with steps, songs, and rhythms aligning participants with cosmic order. The fire burned at the centre of these gatherings, its light illuminating dancers, singers, and speakers, binding them together as one community in the sight of the spiritual world. Death, too, was framed within these beliefs. Funerary practices ensured that the deceased was properly honoured, that the spirit passed safely into the next realm, and that balance for the living was preserved. Fires and chants accompanied burials, and goods were placed with the body to aid in the journey. Improper treatment of the dead could bring imbalance, manifesting as illness or misfortune among the living. Thus, even in mourning, the people observed rituals of fire, water, and purification, binding the transition of the individual into the broader harmony of the universe. When people entered council, they did so in the presence of the fire, ensuring that their words and decisions were bound to the balance it represented. This fusion of the sacred and political reinforced the principle that governance was not separate from spirituality but an extension of it. Festivals and dances reinforced these beliefs throughout the year. Seasonal ceremonies marked planting, hunting, and harvest, each tied to the cycles of nature and the renewal of harmony. Dances were not simply entertainment but forms of prayer, with steps, songs, and rhythms aligning participants with cosmic order. The fire burned at the centre of these gatherings, its light illuminating dancers, singers, and speakers, binding them together as one community in the sight of the spiritual world. Death, too, was framed within these beliefs. Funerary practices ensured that the deceased was properly honoured, that the spirit passed safely into the next realm, and that balance for the living was preserved. Fires and chants accompanied burials, and goods were placed with the body to aid in the journey. Improper treatment of the dead could bring imbalance, manifesting as illness or misfortune among the living. Thus, even in mourning, the people observed rituals of fire, water, and purification, binding the transition of the individual into the broader harmony of the universe. The resilience of these spiritual beliefs was tested by the arrival of European settlers and missionaries, who sought to replace them with Christian doctrines. Missionaries often condemned the sacred fire as pagan and dismissed ceremonies as superstition. Yet the Cherokee held firmly to their traditions, adapting where necessary, but preserving the essence of their beliefs. In some cases, elements of Christianity were woven into the older framework, producing a unique blending of practices. Still, the fire continued to burn, the ceremonies continued to be held, and the language of balance continued to guide life. Even after forced removal from their ancestral lands, the Cherokee carried the sacred fire westward. Oral traditions recall that embers from the original fires were taken and rekindled in Indian Territory, symbolizing the continuity of spiritual life despite the upheaval of displacement. In this way, the fire became not only a religious symbol, but also a sign of cultural survival, proof that even in exile, the people remained bound to their ancestors and their spiritual obligations. Today, Cherokee spiritual beliefs continue to thrive in both traditional and adapted forms. Ceremonial grounds still host dances and rituals, sacred fires are kindled with care, and medicine people continue to practice their healing arts. While modern life has introduced new influences, the underlying principles of balance, respect, and harmony remain intact. The fire still burns at the centre of community, reminding the people of their obligations to one another, to the land, and to the forces that shape existence. To understand the Cherokee through their spiritual beliefs, is to see a people who never separated the sacred from the ordinary. Fire, water, plants, animals, and stories all carried spiritual meaning, and the responsibility of humans was to respect and maintain balance among them. The sacred fire embodied this worldview in its simplest yet most powerful form, a flame that linked heaven, earth, and the community. Around it, the Cherokee lived, governed, and renewed themselves. From this spiritual foundation, the rhythms of daily life took their shape. Farming, hunting, and the routines of work were not merely practical tasks, but acts performed within a sacred framework, infused with the responsibility to maintain harmony. Life among the Cherokee was structured around the land and the resources it provided, with farming, hunting, and daily labour forming the rhythm of existence. Every task was bound not only to survival, but also to the deeper values of balance, respect, and responsibility. From the tending of cornfields to the chase of deer in the forest, each activity was carried out within the framework of traditions that had been handed down for countless generations. To understand Cherokee society, one must enter into the patterns of work and life that sustained their towns and gave meaning to the cycles of the year. Agriculture formed the foundation of sustenance. The fields surrounding each town and village produced corn, beans, and squash, known together as the Three Sisters. Corn stood at the centre of this system, not only as food, but as a sacred gift. Its planting was accompanied by ritual, its cultivation required careful attention, and its harvest was celebrated with ceremonies of renewal. Women were the primary cultivators, responsible for planting, weeding, and harvesting. Their labour was essential, for without it the towns could not endure. Corn was dried and stored in granaries to sustain the community through the winter, while green corn was eaten fresh in summer. Beans climbed the stalks of corn, enriching the soil, while squash spread across the ground, protecting it from erosion and weeds. Together, these crops formed a system of mutual support that mirrored the Cherokee principle of balance. In addition to the staple crops, families tended gardens of sunflowers, gourds, and medicinal herbs. Wild plants were gathered from forests and meadows to supplement the diet, providing berries, nuts, roots, and greens. Hickory nuts were pounded into meal, acorns processed into flour, and wild onions and ramps added flavour to meals. Women possessed deep knowledge of these resources, knowing when and where to gather, how to prepare each plant, and how to use them not only as food, but as medicine. This knowledge was passed from mother to daughter, aunt to niece, ensuring continuity across generations. Hunting provided the essential complement to farming. Men ventured into the forest with bows and arrows, later with muskets acquired through trade, in search of deer, bear, turkey, and smaller game. Deer were particularly important, providing meat for food, hides for clothing, and bones for tools. Nothing was wasted. The hunt was not undertaken casually but with ritual preparation. Hunters fasted, purified themselves in running water, and prayed to the spirits of the animals. When an animal was killed, thanks was given, acknowledging the sacrifice. In this way, hunting was not exploitation, but a relationship, bound by respect and responsibility. Fishing added further variety to the diet. Rivers and streams teemed with fish, which were caught using spears, nets, or traps. Sometimes entire communities worked together, driving fish into weirs constructed of stone or wood. Shellfish such as mussels and crayfish were gathered as well, their shells later fashioned into tools and ornaments. Waterways also served as transportation routes, carrying canoes filled with goods for trade or travel. The rivers were highways of both sustenance and connection, binding villages together across distances. Daily life was shaped by the rhythm of these labours. Women rose early to tend the fields and prepare food, while men set out on hunts or worked on construction, tool-making, or clearing new land. Children contributed according to their age, scaring birds from crops, gathering firewood, or helping in the fields. Elders cared for the youngest, passed on stories, and advised on decisions. Every member of the community had a role, and no labour was without purpose. The collective effort ensured that survival was possible and that cultural traditions were preserved. Homes were built with practicality and care. Summer houses were rectangular, made of poles and bark, designed to allow air to circulate during the heat. Winter houses were smaller, round structures with clay-covered walls that retained warmth during the cold months. At the centre of each home burned a hearth fire, providing both heat and a place to cook. Villages were arranged around central plazas, with a council house or townhouse often situated at the heart, its size reflecting the importance of communal gatherings. These council houses were sometimes large enough to hold the entire town, a reminder that decisions and ceremonies belonged to all, not just to a few. Clothing was made from deer hides, woven plant fibres, and later cloth acquired through trade. Women wore skirts and mantles, while men wore breechcloths and leggings. Both men and women adorned themselves with beads, shells, and feathers, each decoration carrying meaning. Tattoos and painted designs were also common, especially in ceremonial contexts or during war. The body itself became a canvas for expression, a reflection of identity, and a link to tradition. Work and ritual were never fully separate. Planting corn was not only an agricultural task but also a spiritual duty, performed with prayers and songs. Hunting was both a means of sustenance and a relationship with animal spirits. Feasts marked important milestones in the year, such as planting, harvest, or successful hunts, bringing the community together to share food, reaffirm ties, and renew balance. Through these acts, daily life and spiritual life remained inseparable. Games and recreation provided relief from labour. The ball game, known later as stickball, was one of the most important, played with intensity that equaled warfare. Two teams competed using sticks with small netted ends to catch and throw a ball, aiming to strike a goalpost. The game was fast, physical, and often brutal, but it carried deep ritual meaning. Entire communities gathered to watch, wagering on the outcomes, singing songs, and cheering players. Stickball served as both entertainment and a way to resolve disputes, for it allowed towns to compete without bloodshed. Storytelling filled the evenings, particularly during winter when nights were long. Elders recounted the myths of creation, the adventures of Rabbit, the teachings of Kanati and Selu, and the stories of animals and spirits. These tales were not idle amusement, but essential instruction, teaching children how to live, how to respect the natural world, and how to maintain balance. Through stories, values were instilled and memory preserved. Crafts formed another part of daily labour. Pottery continued to be made, with stamp designs marking regional styles. Baskets woven from river cane or white oak served for storage, carrying, and trade. Tools were fashioned from stone, bone, and wood, each crafted with skill and care. Later, when European goods became available, they were integrated into these traditions, but the skills of craftsmanship never disappeared. They were not only practical, but expressions of identity, linking artisans to ancestors and communities. The cycles of the year shaped every part of life. Spring brought planting, accompanied by ceremonies of renewal. Summer demanded labour in the fields and preparation for the green corn ceremony. Autumn was the time of harvest, feasting, and thanksgiving, when surplus was stored for the winter ahead. Winter was quieter, devoted to storytelling, ritual, and rest. Each season carried its duties and its joys, forming a rhythm that connected the people to the land and to one another. Social gatherings reinforced bonds beyond immediate labour. Dances, feasts, and ceremonies filled the plazas with sound and movement. Men and women danced in separate lines, moving to the rhythm of drums, rattles, and songs. Each dance carried meaning, whether to celebrate a harvest, honour a successful hunt, or prepare for war. Participation was not optional but communal, for these gatherings affirmed identity and ensured continuity. Children grew into their roles through this daily life. Boys learned hunting and warfare from their uncles, practicing with small bows and joining hunts as they grew older. Girls learned farming, gathering, and household skills from their mothers and aunts, accompanying them into fields and forests. Play mirrored adult responsibilities, preparing children for the tasks that awaited them. Through work, play, and stories, children absorbed the values of respect, balance, and responsibility that defined Cherokee life. Illness and misfortune were addressed through a combination of practical remedies and spiritual practices. Healers used plants gathered from forests and meadows, each chosen with care and accompanied by chants. Illness was often seen as the result of imbalance or transgression, requiring both physical and spiritual correction. Purification through water immersion, fasting or ritual cleansing accompanied the use of medicines. In this way, healing reflected the larger worldview, binding daily life to spiritual principles. Trade extended the reach of daily life beyond individual towns. Surpluses of corn, beans, hides, pottery, and crafts were exchanged with neighbouring groups, bringing in goods such as shells, copper, and exotic stones. Later, contact with Europeans introduced iron tools, firearms, and cloth, which were incorporated into Cherokee life while older practices continued. Trade was not only economic but social, creating bonds of alliance and mutual dependence. The rhythm of farming, hunting, and daily work created a life that was demanding but deeply meaningful. Each task carried weight, not only for survival but for the preservation of harmony. The Cherokee did not view labour as separate from culture or spirituality. Planting corn, chasing deer, weaving baskets, telling stories. Each was part of a continuum that bound the people to one another, to the land, and to the unseen forces that governed the world. From the fields and forests of daily life rose the encounters with strangers, the first European explorers whose arrival would introduce changes and challenges that tested the resilience of Cherokee traditions. When the first Spanish expeditions pushed into the interior of the southeast in the 16th century, they entered a world already rich with history, traditions, and networks of towns that had thrived for centuries. To the Cherokee, these strangers were unlike any people they had ever seen. They carried metal armour that shone in the sun, rode animals the Cherokee had never encountered, and demanded food and guides with an arrogance that revealed little understanding of the land they moved through. For the Cherokee, these encounters marked the beginning of a long and difficult relationship with Europeans, a relationship that brought both curiosity and devastation. The first known contact came with the expedition of Hernando de Soto, who landed in Florida in 1539 and began a march across the southeast in search of wealth and conquest. His army numbered several hundred men, supported by horses, pigs, dogs, and enslaved indigenous guides taken from earlier expeditions. They cut a path through Florida, Georgia, and into the southern Appalachians, where they encountered towns linked to the ancestral Cherokee. The Spanish were not seeking friendship or trade. They sought gold, food, and submission. Wherever they went, they demanded supplies, seized captives, and spread fear. For the Cherokee, the sudden appearance of these armoured men and their animals must have been staggering. Horses were unlike anything they had seen, towering creatures that carried men across the land faster than a runner could travel. Pigs, left behind to breed and provide food for the Spaniards, multiplied quickly, disturbing local ecosystems and competing with native game. The Spanish brought weapons of iron, crossbows, and firearms, which thundered in ways unfamiliar to those who relied on bows and arrows. Their demands for tribute-strained villages, for food that had been stored to carry families through the winter, was taken to feed the invaders. The encounters were not limited to demands for food. De Soto and his men sought to demonstrate power, capturing leaders and threatening violence if obedience was not shown. Some towns resisted, and battles erupted. The Spanish, with their armour and weapons, often inflicted heavy losses, but they were not invincible. The Cherokee and their neighbours knew the land, moved quickly, and could melt into forests and mountains where the Spaniards struggled to follow. Resistance was costly, but it prevented complete domination. Even more devastating than violence was the spread of disease. The Spanish carried pathogens to which native peoples had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, and influenza moved faster than the invaders themselves, spreading along trade networks and reaching communities that had never seen a European face. The mortality was staggering. Entire towns were depopulated, leaders lost, traditions disrupted. Oral traditions recall times of sickness and death that overwhelmed the people, reshaping their world in ways no battle could match. The Cherokee, like many others across the Americas, faced a demographic catastrophe that weakened them long before European settlement truly began. The Spanish expeditions did not establish permanent colonies in Cherokee lands, but their impact was lasting. De Soto's march ended in failure, his death on the banks of the Mississippi marking the collapse of his ambitions. Later expeditions, such as those led by Juan Pardo, attempted to establish forts in the Carolinas during the 1560s. These forts were small, isolated, and poorly supplied, relying on native communities for support. At first, some Cherokee towns cooperated, offering food and guides in exchange for trade goods such as iron tools and beads. But the arrogance of the Spaniards, their constant demands, and their attempts to impose authority bred resentment. Within a few years, the forts were destroyed by native resistance, and Spanish ambitions in the interior faded. For the Cherokee, these encounters were both destructive and instructive. They revealed the power of European weapons, the dangers of disease, and the greed that drove the strangers. Yet they also demonstrated that Europeans could be resisted, that their power was not absolute, and that survival required caution, adaptation, and unity. Oral traditions from this era often frame the Spaniards as chaotic forces, unpredictable and dangerous, bringing both strange goods and deadly consequences. The introduction of new animals had long-term effects. Horses, though initially terrifying, would later become integrated into Cherokee life after they spread northward from Spanish colonies. They provided new means of travel, hunting, and trade. Pigs, left behind by expeditions, became feral and spread across the southeast, altering hunting practices and damaging crops. These animals became part of the environment, reminders of an encounter that reshaped ecosystems as well as societies. Material goods left by the Spanish also had lasting influence. Iron tools, though rare, proved valuable, sharper and more durable than stone. Glass beads and other trade items circulated through native networks, becoming prized possessions. These objects hinted at a broader world beyond the mountains, a world filled with both opportunities and dangers. The Cherokee began to realize that encounters with Europeans would not be brief intrusions, but ongoing challenges that demanded careful response. The devastation of disease created pressures within Cherokee society. Loss of population disrupted the clan system, weakened towns, and left gaps in leadership. Survivors struggled to maintain traditions while coping with grief and uncertainty. Yet the resilience of the Cherokee allowed them to adapt. Clans absorbed orphans, extended families filled the roles of the lost, and ceremonies continued, even if altered by the absence of so many. The sacred fire still burned in towns, symbolizing continuity despite upheaval. Encounters with the Spanish were not limited to direct meetings. Stories of the strangers spread through trade and travel, reaching communities far beyond the actual routes of expeditions. These stories carried warnings of violence, disease, and greed, but also descriptions of powerful goods and strange animals. They shaped how later encounters with Europeans were understood, teaching caution and skepticism. By the time the English and French entered Cherokee lands in later centuries, the people already carried memories of the Spaniards, memories that influenced how they responded to new outsiders. The 16th century marked the beginning of a new era for the Cherokee. The old world of mound towns, clan systems, and sacred fires remained, but it now faced pressures from beyond the horizon. Diseases thinned populations, new animals appeared in forests and fields, and the memory of violent strangers lingered. Yet the Cherokee endured, adapting to loss and integrating what they could use. The Spanish had come and gone, but the lessons of their passage remained, shaping the strategies of survival that would be needed in the centuries ahead. From these first encounters, the Cherokee would move into a period of shifting worlds as the colonial powers of Europe, Spain, France, and England, competed for influence in the southeast. Each brought new alliances, trade, and conflict, pulling the Cherokee into a global struggle that reached even into their mountain homelands. The 17th and 18th centuries brought the Cherokee into a new and complicated era. The Spanish had passed through with violence and disease, leaving behind devastation but no lasting colonies. In their place, the English and French emerged as dominant powers, competing for control of the southeast and pulling native nations into a contest that was as much about alliances and trade as it was about territory. For the Cherokee, these centuries were marked by shifting worlds, new goods, new threats, and new forms of diplomacy that forced constant adaptation. The first English traders appeared in the early 1600s, moving inland from the Carolina coast. They came not as conquerors, but as merchants, seeking deerskins and other goods in exchange for iron tools, guns, cloth, and beads. For the Cherokee, this trade was both opportunity and danger. Iron hatchets and knives were sharper and more durable than stone tools. Firearms offered new power in hunting and warfare. Cloth provided new materials for clothing, while beads and trinkets became symbols of wealth and connection. These goods quickly integrated into daily life, altering patterns of work and trade. Deerskins became the most important commodity in this exchange. Cherokee hunters supplied hides to traders, who shipped them to Europe, where they were turned into leather for gloves, belts, and shoes. The demand for deerskins grew rapidly, and with it the intensity of hunting. What had once been a practice tied to subsistence and ritual now became part of a global market. Deer populations declined in some areas, forcing hunters to range farther afield. This new economy tied Cherokee labour to European demand, creating dependence on goods that could only be obtained through trade. Guns transformed both hunting and warfare. A skilled hunter with a musket could bring down more game than with a bow, though the need for powder and shot created new forms of dependence. In war, firearms offered deadly advantages but required training and maintenance. The presence of guns escalated conflicts with neighbouring groups as competition for hunting grounds and trade routes intensified. The Cherokee adapted quickly, integrating firearms into their strategies while maintaining older weapons as backup. Trade brought not only goods, but also new forms of diplomacy. English traders sought alliances, promising protection and supplies in exchange for loyalty. The French, moving south from Canada and west from the Mississippi, offered similar deals. The Cherokee, situated between these rival powers, navigated carefully. They played one side against the other, sometimes allying with the English, sometimes with the French, depending on which offered the best terms. This diplomacy was not simple opportunism, but deliberate strategy of survival, maintaining independence in a world increasingly dominated by foreign interests. The arrival of Europeans also introduced new diseases that continued to devastate communities. Smallpox in particular struck repeatedly during the 17th and 18th centuries, reducing populations and destabilizing leadership. Oral traditions recall the scars of these epidemics, the grief of towns emptied, and the fear of sickness that arrived without warning. Despite these losses, the Cherokee rebuilt, drawing on their clan system to absorb orphans, maintain continuity, and preserve traditions. The balance of power within Cherokee society shifted as well. The demands of the deerskin trade elevated the importance of hunters and warriors, while access to European goods became a source of status and authority. Leaders who could secure trade agreements or supply firearms gained influence, sometimes challenging traditional forms of consensus. At the same time, the introduction of Christianity through missionaries introduced new ideas, though adoption was slow and often selective. Some Cherokee incorporated elements of Christian teaching into their worldview, while others resisted, holding firmly to traditional ceremonies and beliefs. Colonial expansion pressed constantly against Cherokee lands. English settlers in Virginia, the Carolinas, and later Georgia pushed westward, seeking farmland. At first, the mountains offered a buffer, but as populations grew, pressure mounted. Treaties were signed, often under duress or through manipulation, ceding lands in exchange for promises of peace or goods that rarely compensated for the loss. The Cherokee faced a constant dilemma: resist and risk war, or negotiate and lose land gradually. Neither choice preserved sovereignty fully, yet both were pursued at different times depending on circumstances. Warfare became a regular feature of the colonial era. The Cherokee fought against rival native groups, sometimes as allies of the English, sometimes on their own behalf. They took part in wars between European powers, such as the conflicts between the French and English, which spread across North America. In these wars, Cherokee warriors fought bravely, earning both fear and respect. Yet they also faced betrayal, as promises of support from European allies were often broken once the immediate conflict ended. The mid-18th century was especially turbulent. During the French and Indian War, the Cherokee initially allied with the British, fighting against the French and their native allies. But tensions quickly rose as British settlers encroached on Cherokee lands and traders cheated their partners. Violence broke out between Cherokee warriors and colonial militias, leading to brutal campaigns that devastated Cherokee towns. The cycle of alliance, betrayal, and conflict repeated, leaving deep scars and hard lessons. Despite these hardships, the Cherokee demonstrated remarkable resilience. They rebuilt towns after destruction, rekindled sacred fires, and maintained their clan system and ceremonies. Leaders emerged who understood both Cherokee traditions and the new realities of colonial diplomacy. They travelled to colonial capitals, negotiated treaties, and sought to protect their people through careful navigation of shifting alliances. These leaders faced immense challenges, balancing the preservation of sovereignty with the need to adapt to an increasingly interconnected world. The introduction of alcohol brought new troubles. Traders often supplied whiskey as part of exchanges, and its effects were devastating. Alcohol disrupted social order, weakened communities, and created dependence. Cherokee leaders recognized the danger and sought to regulate or ban its use, but the lure of trade and the persistence of traders made control difficult. Alcohol became another weapon of colonial influence, undermining stability and deepening dependence on outsiders. Through it all, the sacred traditions of the Cherokee endured. The green corn ceremony continued, the clan system remained strong, and the oral legacy preserved memory. Even as European goods and ideas entered their world, the Cherokee held firmly to their identity. They were not passive victims of colonialism, but active participants in shaping their response, choosing alliances, resisting when necessary, and adapting to survive. The colonial era brought change at every level: economic, political, cultural, and spiritual. The Cherokee were drawn into global networks of trade, warfare, and diplomacy, their towns no longer isolated but connected to distant markets and empires. This world was dangerous, filled with pressures that threatened sovereignty and survival. Yet it also revealed the adaptability and resilience of the Cherokee, qualities that would remain essential in the centuries to come. From this turbulent era, the Cherokee moved into the Age of Revolution, when the conflict between Britain and its colonies would force them once again to navigate shifting alliances, divided loyalties, and the struggle to preserve their people in a world of constant change. When the British Crown extended its influence across the Atlantic world, the Cherokee found themselves drawn deeper into imperial strategies. By the early 18th century, Britain had established colonies along the eastern seaboard that were growing rapidly in population and ambition. For the Cherokee, situated in the Appalachian Highlands and foothills, this expansion meant both opportunity and threat. Trade with the British offered goods that had become central to daily life, but it also carried with it encroachment, broken promises, and new conflicts. Navigating this relationship required diplomacy, adaptability, and a careful balancing of tradition with necessity. The Cherokee had already experienced the power of trade through earlier encounters with English settlers and merchants. Deerskins had become the primary commodity exchanged, with hunters supplying vast numbers of hides to satisfy European demand. In return, the Cherokee acquired firearms, ammunition, cloth, iron tools, and decorative goods. These items were no longer luxuries but necessities, integrated into hunting, farming, and warfare. This dependence gave British traders and officials leverage, for control of supplies meant influence over Cherokee choices. Yet the Cherokee were not powerless. They controlled the land, the hunting grounds, and the knowledge of routes through the mountains. The British needed them as much as they needed British goods. Diplomacy with the Crown took shape through treaties, councils, and the cultivation of alliances. Cherokee leaders travelled to colonial capitals such as Charleston and even across the Atlantic to London, where they met with royal officials and sought to secure recognition of their sovereignty. These journeys were not symbolic alone, they were strategic, intended to establish the Cherokee as allies of Britain and to gain support against rival native nations and encroaching settlers. The presence of Cherokee diplomats in London astonished the public, reminding them that Britain's empire stretched into distant lands, inhabited by powerful nations with their own authority. During the early 18th century, British officials viewed the Cherokee as valuable allies in their struggle against the French and their native partners. The Appalachian region served as a buffer zone, and British governors sought to secure Cherokee loyalty through promises of trade and military support. Forts were built in Cherokee territory, such as Fort Loudon in present-day Tennessee, intended to serve as bases of cooperation and defence. These forts symbolised alliance but also intrusion, as garrisons of soldiers occupied Cherokee land. The relationship was never simple. Trade disputes, dishonest traders, and settler encroachment strained trust. Cherokee hunters worked tirelessly to supply deer skins, but as deer populations declined, the burden grew heavier. Traders often cheated their partners, inflating debts or providing poor quality goods. The introduction of alcohol further destabilized communities, creating dependency and disorder. Despite repeated protests by Cherokee leaders, colonial officials struggled or refused to regulate these abuses. Military alliance was another cornerstone of the relationship. Cherokee warriors fought alongside the British in campaigns against rival native groups and against the French during the 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War. Their participation was crucial, for they provided knowledge of the terrain, skill in forest warfare, and numbers that supplemented British regulars and colonial militias. Cherokee warriors earned reputations as fierce and capable fighters, respected even by their adversaries. Yet these alliances often ended in betrayal. During the French and Indian War, misunderstandings and mistreatment by colonial authorities led to a breakdown of relations. Cherokee warriors who had fought for the British returned home expecting honour and gifts, but instead they faced suspicion and insults. Violence erupted, leading to the Anglo-Cherokee War of 1758 to 1761. This brutal conflict devastated Cherokee towns as British and colonial forces retaliated with scorched earth tactics, burning villages and destroying crops. The Cherokee fought valiantly, ambushing supply lines and striking at forts, but the imbalance of resources eventually forced them to seek peace. The conflict left deep scars, reminding the Cherokee that British friendship could quickly turn to hostility. Despite these betrayals, the Cherokee continued to engage with the Crown. Leaders such as Atakulakula, known as the Little Carpenter, became renowned for their diplomacy. negotiating treaties and striving to protect Cherokee sovereignty. Atakulakula understood the importance of maintaining relations with the British, while also seeking to limit the damage of encroachment. His skills as a negotiator earned him respect from both his people and colonial officials, though he constantly faced the challenge of balancing competing interests. The British Crown recognised the importance of native alliances, particularly after conflicts revealed the dangers of alienating powerful nations. In 1763, following the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, the Crown issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains in an attempt to stabilise relations with native peoples. For the Cherokee, this seemed a recognition of their rights to their homelands. Yet settlers largely ignored the proclamation, pushing westward regardless of royal orders. Colonial governments proved unable or unwilling to restrain their populations, leaving the Cherokee once again to confront waves of intrusion. The Cherokee response to these pressures varied. Some leaders favoured continued diplomacy with the British, believing that trade and alliance offered the best path to survival. Others grew increasingly distrustful, pointing to repeated betrayals and the constant erosion of land. Internal debates reflected the difficulty of choosing between resistance and accommodation, with no simple answers in a world where power dynamics shifted constantly. The influence of the Crown extended beyond politics and economics into cultural life. Missionaries, supported by British colonial authorities, sought to introduce Christianity among the Cherokee. Some individuals adopted aspects of Christian teaching, blending them with traditional beliefs, while others resisted outright. The sacred fire still burned in towns, ceremonies continued, and the clan system endured, demonstrating the resilience of Cherokee traditions even amid external pressures. Cherokee diplomacy reached across the Atlantic as well. In 1730, a delegation of Cherokee leaders travelled to London, where they met King George II and signed the Treaty of Whitehall. The delegation's presence in Britain caused a sensation, with crowds gathering to see them and newspapers reporting extensively on their visit. For the Cherokee, the journey was an assertion of sovereignty, a declaration that they were not subjects but allies, negotiating on equal terms with the Crown. The treaty promised peace and trade, though like many agreements, its promises were only partially honoured. As the 18th century wore on, the relationship between the Cherokee and the British Crown grew increasingly complicated. Trade continued, alliances shifted, and land pressures intensified. The Crown's attempts to regulate settlement were largely ineffective, and colonial expansion pressed relentlessly against Cherokee territory. Leaders struggled to protect their people, negotiating treaty after treaty, each one ceding more land in exchange for temporary peace or vague promises of protection. Yet even amid these losses, the Cherokee maintained their identity. They continued to farm their fields, hunt their forests, and hold their ceremonies. The clan system regulated social life, ensuring continuity even as towns were destroyed and rebuilt. Oral tradition preserved memory, recounting the times of betrayal and resilience. The sacred fire remained the heart of community, burning as a reminder of balance and survival. The era of alliance with the British Crown carried both opportunity and tragedy. It brought goods that transformed daily life, alliances that offered temporary protection, and recognition that affirmed Cherokee sovereignty on paper. But it also brought warfare, betrayal, disease, and the steady loss of land. By the eve of the American Revolution, the Cherokee found themselves once again in a shifting world, forced to choose between alliances with the British, the colonists, or independence in a struggle that would reshape the entire continent. When the struggle between the British Crown and its North American colonies erupted into open conflict in 1775, the Cherokee were once again drawn into a war not of their own making, but one that would profoundly affect their future. The Revolution was more than a contest of armies. It was a civil war, a colonial rebellion, and a global struggle. pulling native nations into a web of shifting loyalties and dangerous choices. For the Cherokee, who had already endured decades of encroachment, broken treaties, and epidemics, the revolution posed a new dilemma: whether to side with the British, who promised to restrain colonial expansion, or with the rebellious colonists, who lived closest and posed the most immediate threat. The result was a period of division, destruction, and hard lessons about the fragility of sovereignty in a world shaped by European power struggles. The roots of Cherokee involvement lay in the years leading up to the Revolution. The Proclamation of 1763 had declared that British colonists were forbidden to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, a measure intended to stabilize relations with native nations. For the Cherokee, this seemed to affirm their rights to their homelands. Yet settlers poured across the mountains regardless, carving farms out of hunting grounds and ignoring royal authority. Colonial governments often encouraged this expansion, and when disputes arose, it was usually native peoples who bore the burden of loss. By the early 1770s, Cherokee leaders watched as more and more of their territory was occupied, their protests ignored, and their promises of protection from the Crown largely unenforced. When the Revolution broke out, British officials sought Cherokee support. They argued that the colonists were the real enemies, the ones who invaded Cherokee lands, and that the Crown remained the protector of native rights. Weapons, ammunition, and supplies were promised in exchange for Cherokee alliance. Many leaders found this argument persuasive. To side with the British was to resist the settlers who posed the greatest immediate danger. Yet not all agreed. Some Cherokee leaders doubted British sincerity, pointing to past betrayals and the Crown's inability to enforce its own proclamations. Others argued that neutrality offered the best chance of survival, avoiding entanglement in a war between outsiders. The debate revealed divisions within Cherokee society. Towns and clans differed in their perspectives, and there was no single unified decision. Some favoured the British, others leaned toward the colonists, and still others sought to remain apart. This diversity of opinion reflected both the independence of Cherokee communities and the difficulty of choosing wisely in a war whose outcome was uncertain. In 1776, as the revolution intensified, Cherokee warriors launched attacks on frontier settlements in the Carolinas and Virginia. These raids, encouraged and supplied by British agents, aimed to drive settlers out of Cherokee territory and reassert control over hunting grounds. At first, the attacks caused panic among the colonists, who feared a wider native uprising. But colonial militias responded with overwhelming force. Campaigns of retaliation swept into Cherokee lands, burning villages, destroying crops, and leaving devastation in their wake. Entire towns were reduced to ashes, families displaced, and food supplies ruined. The violence of 1776 marked a turning point, as the Cherokee realized that their homelands could be ravaged regardless of alliances or promises. Leaders such as Dragging Canoe emerged during this time, representing a militant stance against colonial encroachment. Dragging Canoe, son of the influential Atakulakula, argued that compromise and negotiation had failed, that only resistance could preserve Cherokee lands. He and his followers rejected peace agreements and continued to fight, even as other leaders sought accommodation. This split gave rise to divisions that would shape Cherokee politics for decades. Those who followed Dragging Canoe came to be known as the Chickamauga, a group that moved further downriver and established new towns from which they continued their resistance against settlers and later the United States. The Revolution brought devastation to Cherokee lands. Repeated campaigns by colonial militias destroyed towns, disrupted farming cycles, and caused hunger and displacement. Disease, already a recurring scourge, spread in the chaos, further weakening communities. The sacred fires were extinguished in many places, towns abandoned and families scattered. Yet even in the midst of destruction, resilience persisted. Survivors rebuilt towns, rekindled fires, and continued ceremonies, affirming continuity despite loss. Diplomacy continued alongside warfare. Some Cherokee leaders sought peace with the colonists, recognizing the futility of prolonged resistance. Treaties were signed, often under duress, ceding more land in exchange for temporary peace. These agreements rarely held, for settlers continued to push westward regardless of boundaries. The Revolution revealed the limits of treaties, showing that promises made in council could be broken in practice when settlers demanded land. The British, despite their promises, provided limited support. Supplies often failed to arrive, and their military campaigns were focused on other regions. For the Cherokee, this reinforced doubts about British reliability. Even those who sided with the Crown found themselves largely abandoned when the war turned against Britain. When the Revolution ended in 1783 with American independence, the Cherokee faced a new reality. The British, their supposed allies, had ceded vast tracts of native land to the United States without consultation, treating indigenous nations as if they were mere obstacles rather than sovereign peoples. For the Cherokee, the Revolution was thus both a war of divided loyalties and a lesson in the fragility of alliances with European powers. They had fought bravely, suffered deeply, and negotiated repeatedly, yet in the end their lands were further encroached upon, their population reduced, and their sovereignty ignored. The emergence of the United States as an independent power posed new challenges. For the settlers who had once been subjects of the Crown were now masters of their own government, determined to expand westward regardless of promises. The internal divisions created during the Revolution did not disappear. The Chickamauga under Dragging Canoe continued resistance into the 1790s, launching raids against frontier settlements and allying with other native nations. Other Cherokee leaders pursued diplomacy with the new United States, signing treaties in hopes of preserving what land remained. This divergence reflected both the resilience of Cherokee political traditions and the difficulty of facing a colonial power determined to expand. The Revolution also introduced new ideas into Cherokee society. The language of liberty, rights, and self-determination, heard in colonial rhetoric, resonated in unexpected ways. Some Cherokee saw parallels between their own struggle for sovereignty and the colonists' claims of oppression by Britain. Others dismissed the rhetoric as hypocrisy, pointing to the colonists' relentless seizure of native lands as evidence that their talk of freedom applied only to themselves. These debates reflected the growing complexity of Cherokee engagement with the broader world, as they grappled with ideas that both inspired and betrayed them. The Revolution ended with Cherokee lands diminished, their population weakened, and their sovereignty under greater threat than ever. Yet it also marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the Cherokee would engage directly with the United States as a sovereign nation, negotiating, resisting, and adapting in a struggle that would define their future. From the fires of the Revolution, the Cherokee entered the uncertain world of a new republic, where expansion, treaties, and the struggle for survival would continue to shape their destiny. By the late 18th century, the Cherokee were facing relentless pressure on their homelands. What had once been a vast territory stretching across the southern Appalachians, covering parts of present-day Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, and Kentucky, was gradually shrinking under the steady push of settlers. The Revolution had ended, but the new United States inherited not only the ambitions of the colonies, but also their hunger for land. For the Cherokee, the struggle was no longer about distant imperial powers alone, but about survival in the face of a growing population that seemed determined to consume their world piece by piece. The earliest waves of settlers after independence poured across the mountains from Virginia and the Carolinas into the fertile valleys of Tennessee and northern Georgia. These settlers often ignored treaties, moving into Cherokee hunting grounds, clearing fields and building cabins where deer once roamed and corn had been planted. The frontier was not a line respected by both sides, but a zone of constant intrusion and conflict. The Cherokee protested repeatedly, sending delegations to the new government in hopes of securing recognition of their boundaries. Yet even when treaties were signed, enforcement was weak, and settlers pushed forward regardless of legal promises. The new American government pursued a policy that combined negotiation, coercion, and military force. Officials spoke of peace and friendship but demanded cessions of land in exchange for that peace. Treaties were drawn up that ceded vast tracts of territory, often in return for vague assurances of protection or for supplies that could not replace the value of the land itself. These treaties were signed under pressure, sometimes by leaders who sought to avoid bloodshed, sometimes by factions willing to compromise, and sometimes without full consent of the people they claimed to represent. Once signed, they were treated as binding by the United States, regardless of Cherokee protests. The pattern repeated itself across decades. Land was ceded in one treaty, settlers filled it, and soon new pressures arose for further cessions. Each loss reduced the space available for hunting and farming, undermining the foundation of Cherokee life. Deer became scarcer as forests were cleared, while fields that once produced corn were taken over by new farms. The economic base of Cherokee society eroded, forcing greater dependence on trade with settlers and on goods supplied by the United States. Resistance did not disappear. Leaders like Dragging Canoe and the Chickamauga towns continued to fight into the 1790s, launching raids against frontier settlements and seeking alliances with other native nations and with European powers such as Spain. These efforts slowed but did not stop expansion. The United States, determined to secure its frontiers, launched military campaigns that struck at resistant towns, burning villages and forcing survivors further west or deeper into the mountains. Each campaign left scars but also demonstrated Cherokee resilience, for even after devastation, communities rebuilt, rekindled fires, and continued ceremonies. Diplomacy remained a constant tool as well. Cherokee leaders travelled to the new capital cities of the United States, negotiating directly with presidents, Congress, and federal officials. Figures such as Alexander McGillivray, though more associated with the Creek, influenced Cherokee strategies by showing the possibilities of direct negotiation with national leaders. Cherokee envoys argued that they were sovereign nations, deserving of recognition and protection. At times, federal officials acknowledged this sovereignty, but in practice, the demand for land from settlers always outweighed promises of respect. The introduction of a new vision of civilization by the United States added another layer to these pressures. Leaders such as George Washington and Henry Knox spoke of a policy to civilize native nations, encouraging them to adopt European methods of farming, dress, and governance. The Cherokee, already skilled farmers, were told to abandon hunting and focus exclusively on agriculture, to live in nuclear families instead of extended clan households, and to adopt Christianity. The United States presented this as benevolent guidance, but it was deeply tied to land. By pushing native peoples to settle permanently in smaller areas, officials sought to free up more hunting grounds for white settlers. Some Cherokee adopted aspects of these reforms, seeing in them a way to adapt and preserve sovereignty. They experimented with new farming tools, raised livestock, and sent their children to mission schools. Others resisted, viewing these changes as an attack on tradition and identity. The result was a society divided not only by external pressures, but also by internal debates about the best path forward. Loss of land brought cultural and social consequences. The clan system, once supported by vast territories and abundant resources, struggled under the weight of scarcity. Families forced into closer quarters faced new tensions, while hunting, a vital part of male identity, became less feasible as game declined. The sacred relationship between people and land was strained, for ceremonies tied to particular places could no longer be held when those places were occupied or destroyed. Yet adaptation continued, with communities finding ways to preserve traditions in smaller spaces, holding ceremonies in new locations, and maintaining oral memory of the lands that had been lost. The steady reduction of territory was recorded in a long series of treaties, Hopewell in 1785, Holston in 1791, Tellico in 1798, and many others. Each one marked another step in the erosion of Cherokee sovereignty. Hopewell, signed at the end of the Revolution, established initial boundaries but quickly proved ineffective as settlers ignored them. Holston followed a few years later, promising annuities and protection in exchange for more land. In practice, protection was minimal, and the land was lost permanently. By the end of the 18th century, Cherokee territory had been reduced by more than half, and the process showed no signs of stopping. Amid this loss, new leaders emerged who sought to navigate the crisis with both diplomacy and adaptation. Figures such as Doublehead, Black Fox, and later Major Ridge and John Ross argued over strategies, some favouring accommodation to preserve what remained, others insisting on resistance. These debates reveal the deep fractures created by constant expansion, for there were no easy solutions in a world where every choice seemed to bring further loss. Settler expansion was not merely physical but cultural. Schools established by missionaries introduced English, Christianity, and new forms of governance. Some Cherokee embraced these opportunities, seeing literacy and new political structures as tools to preserve independence in negotiations with the United States. Sequoyah's creation of the syllabary in the early 19th century was partly inspired by this context, providing a uniquely Cherokee means of literacy that asserted identity even amid pressures to assimilate. The loss of land thus fueled innovations as well as despair, producing leaders and ideas that sought to ensure survival despite overwhelming odds. The expansion of settlers was relentless. Frontier families moved westward, drawn by cheap land and the promise of independence. They viewed the Cherokee not as sovereign nations, but as obstacles. Violence flared constantly, with raids, counter-raids, and retaliatory campaigns. Settlers demanded government intervention, and the United States, eager to satisfy its citizens, repeatedly pressured the Cherokee into new treaties. Even when violence subsided temporarily, the steady push of cabins, fields, and roads marked the advance of dispossession. By the early 19th century, the Cherokee found themselves confined to a fraction of their original lands. What had once been millions of acres of mountains, valleys, and rivers was reduced to a core area in northern Georgia, western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, and parts of Alabama. This territory, though still fertile and beautiful, was far smaller than the expanse their ancestors had known. The memory of lost lands remained alive in stories, songs, and ceremonies, binding the people to places they could no longer inhabit physically, but still carried in cultural identity. This long era of loss was not simply a series of defeats. It revealed the endurance and resilience of the Cherokee, who adapted their farming, governance, and diplomacy to survive. They did not vanish with the loss of land, but continued to assert their sovereignty, creating a national council, adopting a written constitution, and building a society that blended tradition with adaptation. Yet the relentless expansion of settlers meant that even these efforts faced constant challenge. The struggle over land was not ended by these treaties or adaptations. It carried directly into the early 19th century, when the rise of the United States as a powerful republic brought new pressures, new negotiations, and ultimately the tragedy of forced removal. Among the many figures who shaped the history of the Cherokee, none stands out more than Sequoyah, the man who gave his people a written form of their language. His creation of the syllabary in the early 19th century was one of the most remarkable achievements in native history, a feat that transformed the Cherokee nation and gave them a tool of resilience in a time of mounting pressure and dispossession. At a moment when their lands were shrinking and their sovereignty threatened, the gift of literacy offered strength, continuity, and a new way to preserve identity. Sequoyah, also known as George Guest, or Guest in English records, was born in the 1770s in what is now eastern Tennessee. His father may have been a European trader, though accounts differ, but his mother, Woodte, was Cherokee, and through her he belonged to the Paint clan. Sequoyah grew up within Cherokee society, speaking the language fluently and absorbing its traditions, but he also lived in a world where contact with Europeans and Americans was constant. Traders, missionaries, and officials all used writing as a source of power, recording treaties, accounts, and laws in ways that the Cherokee could not easily challenge. Sequoyah observed this imbalance and began to wonder whether his people could have a written language of their own. He was not a man of wealth or high status. Sequoyah worked as a blacksmith and silversmith, crafting tools and ornaments for both Cherokee and settlers. He served briefly as a soldier during the War of 1812, fighting alongside other Cherokee allies of the United States. In these roles, he saw firsthand how written documents carried weight in military and political affairs. Soldiers received written orders, treaties were enforced through signatures, and letters carried messages across distances. Sequoyah realized that writing was not merely a curiosity, but a source of authority, a way to preserve memory and transmit knowledge. Around 1809, he began his efforts to create a system for writing Cherokee. At first, he experimented with symbols that represented whole words or ideas, but the complexity proved overwhelming. He shifted instead to the idea of syllables, recognizing that Cherokee words were built from a limited set of sounds that could be represented individually. Through years of trial and error, he developed a system of 86 characters, each representing a distinct syllable. The symbols were original, though some resembled letters from English, Greek, or other scripts. Their genius lay in their simplicity. With only a few dozen characters, the entire Cherokee language could be written and read. His work was met with skepticism. Many Cherokee doubted the usefulness of writing, while others feared it as a form of witchcraft or foreign influence. Sequoyah persisted, teaching his daughter, Ayoke, to use the syllabary. She quickly demonstrated its effectiveness, proving that anyone could learn it in a short time. As more people saw how words could be recorded and read back accurately, skepticism gave way to astonishment. The syllabary spread rapidly, embraced by a nation eager to strengthen itself in the face of external threats. By the 1820s, literacy in Cherokee was widespread. Missionaries who had long promoted English literacy were surprised to see Cherokee people learning to read and write their own language at rates higher than many surrounding white communities. Letters, legal documents, and even poetry were written in the syllabary. The Cherokee Phoenix, the first Native American newspaper, began publication in 1828, printing in both Cherokee and English. This newspaper became a powerful tool of communication, spreading news, debates, and cultural pride across the nation. The syllabary was more than a technical achievement. It was an act of sovereignty. In adopting a written form of their language, the Cherokee asserted that they were not merely adapting to American models, but creating their own path. Sequoyah's invention allowed them to record laws, constitutions, and histories in their own words. It gave them the ability to engage with the United States on more equal terms, presenting documents and correspondence in writing rather than relying solely on translators. It also allowed them to preserve oral traditions, sacred stories, and family records in a durable form, ensuring continuity in the face of displacement. The adoption of the syllabary coincided with broader efforts at nation building. During the early 19th century, the Cherokee established a national council, codified laws, and adopted a written constitution modelled partly on that of the United States. They built schools, churches, and courts, blending elements of European American society with their own traditions. Literacy supported these reforms, enabling record-keeping, legislation, and communication across a dispersed population. The Cherokee presented themselves as a civilized nation, fully capable of self-government, hoping to secure recognition and protection from the United States. Sequoyah himself remained a respected figure throughout his life. He continued to promote the use of the syllabary, travelling widely to teach others and to encourage its adoption among other native nations. He believed that literacy could strengthen not only the Cherokee, but all indigenous peoples, giving them tools to resist cultural erasure. his vision extended beyond his own community, reflecting a broader hope for native survival and adaptation in a rapidly changing world. The syllabary's impact was profound. It fostered a sense of unity and pride at a time when the Cherokee were under immense pressure. It provided a means to preserve traditions while also engaging with modernity. It demonstrated that innovation and tradition were not opposites, but could work together. Even as land was lost and threats grew, the syllabary offered a form of resilience that could not be taken away by treaties or soldiers. The spread of literacy also brought new debates. Some feared that writing would weaken oral tradition, undermining the role of elders as keepers of memory. Others argued that it strengthened tradition by preserving stories that might otherwise be lost. In practice, both forms coexisted. Oral storytelling continued to thrive, while written texts provided new ways to preserve and share knowledge. The result was a richer, more diverse cultural life, blending the old with the new. For the United States, the rise of Cherokee literacy was a challenge. It contradicted stereotypes of native peoples as uncivilized or incapable of progress. The sight of Cherokee leaders writing letters, publishing newspapers, and passing laws in their own language unsettled those who sought to justify dispossession. It showed that the Cherokee were not obstacles to civilization but a nation in their own right, capable of adopting and adapting innovations while maintaining identity. Sequoyah's invention thus carried political as well as cultural weight. It strengthened Cherokee society internally while projecting an image of sovereignty externally. At a time when removal policies were beginning to take shape, the syllabary was a powerful statement that the Cherokee were not a vanishing people but a thriving one determined to endure. Sequoyah lived long enough to see the fruits of his work. He travelled west after removal began, continuing to teach the syllabary among the Cherokee who had relocated to Indian Territory. His vision of a literate people endured, even as the tragedy of the Trail of Tears unfolded. He died in the 1840s, but his legacy remained, enshrined not only in the syllabary itself but in the continued resilience of his people. The birth of the Cherokee syllabary was one of the great achievements of native history, a testament to the creativity, determination and vision of a man who understood the power of writing and gave it to his people. It stands as proof that innovation could arise from within, that adaptation could be shaped on Cherokee terms, and that resilience could take many forms. From the syllabary and the flowering of literacy, the Cherokee moved into what some historians call their Golden Age, a period in the early 19th century when national institutions flourished, towns prospered, and cultural pride was strong, even as new challenges gathered on the horizon. By the early decades of the 19th century, the Cherokee nation had entered what many later described as its Golden Age, a period of flourishing culture, political development, and economic strength. It was a time when the people, though pressed by encroaching settlers and threatened by federal policies, built a society that combined traditional values with new institutions, showing the world that they were not a fading people, but a nation capable of innovation, resilience, and leadership. The Golden Age did not erase the losses of the past or the dangers of the future, but it stands as a testament to the determination of the Cherokee to thrive in the face of overwhelming pressure. The foundations of this era had been laid in the years following the American Revolution, when Cherokee leaders recognized that survival required adaptation. Land was being lost through treaties, settlers were pouring across frontiers, and the United States was emerging as a powerful republic determined to expand. Against this backdrop, the Cherokee undertook deliberate reforms, seeking to strengthen their political unity, modernize aspects of their society, and present themselves as a sovereign nation deserving of recognition. One of the most striking developments of this period was the adoption of a national constitution. In 1827, after years of discussion and debate, Cherokee leaders drafted and ratified a written constitution modelled in part on that of the United States. It established a bicameral legislature, an executive branch with a principal chief, and a judiciary. John Ross, one of the most prominent figures of this era, rose to become principal chief, guiding the nation with a blend of traditional authority and modern statesmanship. The Constitution was a bold declaration of sovereignty, asserting that the Cherokee were not a loose collection of towns or clans, but a unified nation with laws and governance. The new government functioned from New Echota, the Cherokee capital established in present-day Georgia. New Echota became a symbol of national pride, with council houses, courts, and schools that reflected the blending of Cherokee and American forms. Laws were debated and passed. Courts adjudicated disputes, and leaders corresponded with officials in Washington, D.C. The Cherokee Phoenix, the bilingual newspaper launched in 1828, circulated from New Echota, spreading information, debates, and cultural pride across the nation. The presence of a printing press, producing materials in both English and the Cherokee syllabary, symbolized the strength of the nation's identity and its engagement with modern tools. Economic life also thrived during this period. Cherokee farmers, long skilled in agriculture, adapted new techniques and crops introduced through contact with Americans. Many adopted plows, wagons, and livestock, expanding beyond corn, beans, and squash to raise cotton and wheat. Some Cherokee families established plantations worked by enslaved African Americans, a practice that reflected the adoption of Southern agricultural models, but also revealed the complexities of Cherokee society, which was never uniform in its adaptations. Others continued traditional methods of farming, supplementing crops with hunting, gathering, and trade. Across the nation, towns prospered, producing surpluses that were sold in markets and exchanged with neighbours. Education became another cornerstone of the Golden Age. Mission schools, though often driven by the goal of Christian conversion, provided literacy and training in English, which many Cherokee families embraced as a way to navigate the world of treaties and negotiations. At the same time, the syllabary spread rapidly, ensuring that Cherokee literacy flourished on its own terms. By the 1830s, Cherokee literacy rates were higher than those of many neighbouring white communities, a fact that astonished outsiders who still clung to stereotypes of native peoples as incapable of progress. Children grew up learning to read in both English and Cherokee, creating a bilingual generation capable of bridging cultures. Religion reflected a similar blend of continuity and change. Traditional ceremonies continued at ceremonial grounds, where the sacred fire burned and the green corn ceremony renewed balance. At the same time, Christianity gained a foothold, especially among those educated in mission schools. Some Cherokee converted fully, while others blended Christian teachings with traditional beliefs, creating a uniquely Cherokee form of spirituality. This coexistence of old and new reflected the broader character of the Golden Age: adaptation without abandonment, innovation without erasure. Political leadership was strong during this period. John Ross, who served as principal chief for decades, was a central figure, guiding the nation through both prosperity and crisis. His leadership style emphasized consensus, diplomacy, and persistence. He believed firmly in the sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation and fought tirelessly to defend it in negotiations with the United States. Other leaders, such as Major Ridge, Elias Boudinot, and John Ridge, also played important roles, though divisions among them would later have tragic consequences. Together, they represented a generation of statesmen who sought to prove that the Cherokee were equal to any nation in their ability to govern themselves. The Cherokee Phoenix was a powerful voice in this era. Edited by Elias Boudinot, it published articles on national politics, education, agriculture, and religion, as well as translations of laws and debates. It allowed Cherokee citizens to stay informed about national affairs and connected them to global events. The newspaper also served as a tool of diplomacy, demonstrating to outsiders that the Cherokee were a literate, organised people with a thriving press. In an age when newspapers shaped public opinion, the Phoenix was a declaration of modern nationhood. Cultural pride flourished as well. Traditional crafts such as basket weaving, pottery, and beadwork continued, often sold in markets alongside newer goods. Music, dance, and storytelling remained central to communal life, binding the people to their heritage even as they engaged with the modern world. The syllabary allowed for the preservation of songs, myths, and histories in written form, ensuring that oral tradition was not lost but expanded. This cultural flowering stood as a counter-argument to the narratives of disappearance that so often accompany discussions of native peoples in the 19th century. Yet the Golden Age was shadowed by growing external threats. Settlers in Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee looked with envy on Cherokee lands, particularly as cotton became the dominant crop of the South. The discovery of gold in northern Georgia in 1829 intensified this pressure, sparking a rush of fortune seekers who flooded into Cherokee territory illegally. The state of Georgia passed laws extending its authority over Cherokee lands, ignoring federal treaties, and seeking to dismantle the Cherokee government. The Cherokee, despite their flourishing society, faced a storm gathering on the horizon. The Cherokee responded with determination. They petitioned Congress, hired lawyers, and pursued their case in the courts of the United States. Their legal battles reached the Supreme Court, where decisions such as Worcester v. Georgia in 1832 affirmed their sovereignty and declared state laws over their territory invalid. Yet President Andrew Jackson, a staunch supporter of removal, refused to enforce the court's decision, reportedly saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." The Golden Age, for all its achievements, was thus confronted by the raw reality of American expansion and the refusal of federal power to honour treaties and laws. Even in the face of these threats, the Cherokee Golden Age left a lasting legacy. It demonstrated that native nations could adapt to modern political and economic forms while maintaining their identity. It proved that literacy, governance, and prosperity were not foreign to indigenous peoples, but could be developed on their own terms. It inspired pride and unity at a time when unity was desperately needed. The Golden Age was not merely a moment of prosperity, but a powerful assertion of sovereignty, culture, and resilience. From the flowering of this period, the Cherokee would soon be forced into one of the darkest chapters of their history, as removal policies culminated in the Trail of Tears. Yet even that tragedy could not erase the memory of what the Cherokee had built, nor the institutions and traditions that continued to sustain them in exile. By the 1830s, the Cherokee Nation had built schools, courts, a national council, a constitution, and a bilingual press. They had demonstrated to the world that they were not only survivors but innovators, blending tradition with adaptation. Yet none of this could shield them from the expansionist hunger of the United States. The policy of Indian removal, driven by federal power and state governments, brought the Cherokee into a confrontation that would end in one of the most tragic and defining moments of their history, the forced march westward that became known as the Trail of Tears. The pressure began to mount long before the actual removal. Settlers in Georgia and neighbouring states had long resented the presence of Cherokee towns and farms on fertile land. The discovery of gold in northern Georgia in 1829 intensified those tensions, sparking a rush of miners and settlers who ignored the legal boundaries of Cherokee territory. The state of Georgia moved quickly to assert authority, passing laws that extended state jurisdiction into Cherokee lands, nullifying Cherokee laws, and stripping the nation of political rights within its borders. It became illegal for Cherokee people to testify against white citizens in court, effectively denying them legal protection. Missionaries who resisted these measures were arrested. The Cherokee fought back through diplomacy and the courts. Their leaders, including John Ross, the principal chief, petitioned Congress and the President, arguing that the treaties signed between the United States and the Cherokee guaranteed their sovereignty. Their struggle culminated in cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1831, in Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, The court ruled that the Cherokee were not a foreign nation but a domestic dependent nation, denying them the standing to sue as a sovereign power. The following year in Worcester v. Georgia, the court went further, ruling that Georgia's laws had no force within Cherokee territory, and affirming the federal government's responsibility to uphold Cherokee rights. It was a major legal victory on paper, but President Andrew Jackson refused to enforce it, leaving the Cherokee exposed to state encroachment. In 1830, Congress had already passed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the federal government to negotiate treaties to relocate native nations west of the Mississippi River. Supporters of removal argued that it would protect native peoples from extinction by giving them land far from white settlers, but in practice it served the interests of expansion and cotton agriculture. For the Cherokee, removal meant the loss of their homeland, the disruption of their society, and the violation of their sovereignty. John Ross and the majority of the Cherokee resisted removal, insisting on their right to remain on ancestral lands. They organised petitions, gathering thousands of signatures from Cherokee citizens protesting the policy. They travelled to Washington, lobbying Congress and pleading with sympathetic politicians. Ross argued that the Cherokee had done everything asked of them by the United States. They had adopted a constitution, established schools, embraced literacy, and maintained peace. To remove them now was to betray every principle of justice and every promise made in treaties. Yet within the nation, divisions emerged. A small group of leaders, including Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, came to believe that removal was inevitable. They argued that resistance would only bring destruction, and that negotiating a treaty could at least secure better terms for survival. Acting without the authorization of the Cherokee National Council, they signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, ceding all Cherokee lands east of the Mississippi in exchange for territory in Indian Territory, annuities, and assistance with relocation. The vast majority of Cherokee denounced the treaty as fraudulent, but the United States Senate ratified it by a single vote, using it as the legal basis for removal. In 1838, federal troops and state militias began the process of rounding up the Cherokee for forced relocation. Soldiers entered towns and farms, often with little warning, driving families from their homes and herding them into stockades. Reports from the time describe scenes of chaos and sorrow, families torn apart, possessions left behind, homes looted, and sacred fires extinguished. The stockades were overcrowded and unsanitary, with disease spreading quickly among the detainees. Food was scarce and conditions were harsh, foreshadowing the suffering to come. The removal itself took the form of several routes westward, some by river, others by land. Thousands of Cherokee were forced to march under military escort, covering hundreds of miles to reach the designated territory in present-day Oklahoma. The journey took place through harsh weather, with inadequate supplies, poor shelter, and little medical care. Elderly people, children, and the sick suffered the most, but no one was spared the hardships. Along the roadsides, graves multiplied, dug quickly in frozen ground or muddy soil as disease, exposure, and exhaustion claimed lives. Estimates of the death toll vary, but it is believed that around 4,000 of the 16,000 Cherokee forced to march perished along the way, about a quarter of the entire population. For those who survived, the trauma was searing. They carried with them the memory of the loved ones lost, of the homeland left behind, and of the injustice inflicted upon them despite their efforts to coexist peacefully with the United States. The Trail of Tears was not a single march, but a series of removals carried out in waves. Some groups were transported by riverboats, where outbreaks of disease spread quickly in cramped quarters. Others were driven overland during the winter of 1838-1839, enduring snow, rain, and freezing temperatures with inadequate clothing. Soldiers pushed the pace, and those who fell behind risked being left to die. Oral histories passed down among Cherokee families describe the sorrow of mothers burying infants by the roadside, of elders collapsing from exhaustion and of the grief that marked every mile. Even in this time of suffering, the resilience of the Cherokee endured. Leaders such as John Ross accompanied the people on the march, sharing their hardships and working tirelessly to secure better supplies and conditions. The clan system continued to provide support, with families caring for one another and sharing what little they had. The sacred fire, though extinguished in the homeland, was rekindled in the West, symbolizing continuity despite the rupture. Songs and prayers carried the people forward, affirming identity even when everything else seemed lost. For the United States, the removal was presented as a policy success, clearing the southeast for white settlement and expanding the cotton frontier. For the Cherokee, it was a catastrophe, a forced exile that tore them from the land of their ancestors and cost thousands of lives. Yet it was also a turning point, after which the nation rebuilt itself in new lands, demonstrating a resilience that defied the intentions of those who had sought their destruction. The Trail of Tears remains one of the most remembered episodes in Cherokee history, not only for its suffering, but for what it revealed about both the cruelty of American expansion and the strength of Cherokee survival. It was the culmination of decades of pressure, treaties, and encroachment, but it was not the end of the Cherokee story. In Indian Territory, the people would rebuild towns, re-establish government, and carry forward the institutions of their golden age, adapting once again to a new and harsh reality. From the ashes of removal, the Cherokee entered the long struggle of rebuilding in exile, preserving their identity while adapting to life in an unfamiliar land west of the Mississippi. The forced removal of the Cherokee from their homeland was meant to destroy them as a people. Soldiers, politicians, and settlers believed that by driving them west of the Mississippi, they would erase the Cherokee presence from the fertile lands of Georgia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, clearing the way for cotton, slavery, and the expansion of the American South. Yet when the survivors of the Trail of Tears arrived in Indian Territory, broken from the journey, grieving the thousands who had perished, and uncertain about what lay ahead, they did not collapse into defeat. They began the long and painful work of rebuilding. In exile, far from the mountains and valleys of their ancestors, the Cherokee constructed towns, re-established their government, reopened schools, rekindled their sacred fire, and laid the foundations of a new life in an unfamiliar land. The land set aside for them lay in what is now northeastern Oklahoma, a region of rolling hills, forests, rivers, and prairies. It was fertile enough for farming, but it was not the homeland. The ridges of Appalachia, the streams where ceremonies had been held, and the ancient mounds where ancestors rested were gone, left behind forever. At first, the loss was overwhelming. Families mourned not only those who had died on the march, but the places that had given meaning to their lives. Yet within this sorrow, leaders urged their people to rebuild. John Ross, who had walked the Trail of Tears with his people, pressed for the re-establishment of national institutions. He argued that survival depended not only on physical endurance, but on the restoration of government, culture, and identity. One of the first tasks was to reorganize the Cherokee Nation politically. The constitution adopted in the 1820s, which had been a proud symbol of sovereignty, was reinstated. The National Council met once again, now in Indian Territory, drafting laws, regulating disputes, and seeking to restore order. John Ross continued as principal chief, though his leadership was contested by some, particularly those associated with the Treaty Party, who had signed the Treaty of New Echota. Tensions between the Ross faction and the Ridge-Boudinot faction ran deep, fueled by anger over the removal and the divisions it had caused. These tensions erupted in violence shortly after resettlement, when Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot were assassinated by fellow Cherokees who blamed them for betraying the nation. The killings revealed the depth of bitterness left by the removal, but they also forced the Cherokee to confront the danger of internal division. Despite these conflicts, the process of rebuilding continued. The capital was established at Tahlequah, where a council house and other government buildings were constructed. From this centre, laws were passed, courts operated, and national leaders sought to bring stability. The Cherokee Constitution was not an empty document, but a living framework that guided recovery, asserting that even in exile the Cherokee remained a sovereign nation with the right to govern themselves. Agriculture became the foundation of economic recovery. Families cleared land, planted corn, beans, squash, and later cotton, and raised livestock. Farming was not easy in the unfamiliar environment, but Cherokee knowledge of agriculture and adaptation allowed them to succeed. The presence of enslaved African Americans, who had been brought west by some Cherokee families who practiced slavery, added complexity to this recovery, reflecting both the influence of Southern society and the contradictions within Cherokee life. Still, most families depended on their own labour, and the rhythms of planting and harvest provided a sense of continuity. Education was quickly re-established as well. Schools were built, often with the support of missionaries but guided by Cherokee leadership. The syllabary continued to spread, ensuring that literacy in Cherokee remained strong. Newspapers were revived, with the Cherokee Advocate beginning publication in 1844, carrying news in both English and Cherokee. The presence of a national press symbolized the determination to maintain identity and communicate across the scattered settlements of Indian Territory. Religion reflected both tradition and adaptation. Ceremonial grounds were re-established, with sacred fires rekindled to ensure continuity of rituals. The green corn ceremony and other important observances continued, affirming the spiritual foundations of Cherokee life. At the same time, Christianity expanded, with churches built across Indian Territory. Some Cherokee converted fully, while others blended Christian practices with traditional beliefs. This coexistence mirrored the broader character of rebuilding, continuity alongside adaptation. Social life reorganized as families and clans adjusted to new surroundings. The clan system endured, regulating marriage, kinship, and responsibility, though it was challenged by the pressures of displacement and the influence of American legal systems. Extended families provided the primary safety net, caring for widows, orphans, and the elderly who had been left vulnerable by removal. Communities gathered for dances, storytelling, and games, reaffirming cultural bonds that had survived the march. The trauma of the Trail of Tears remained ever present. Elders spoke of those lost along the way, ensuring that memory did not fade. Songs, prayers, and stories preserved the sorrow of removal, but they also emphasized survival. The very act of rebuilding became a form of resistance, proof that the Cherokee could not be erased. Children grew up hearing both the stories of loss and the lessons of endurance, learning that their identity depended not only on remembering the homeland, but on sustaining the nation in new lands. Relations with the United States continued to shape life in Indian Territory. The federal government claimed oversight, sending agents to monitor Cherokee affairs, but the nation maintained its independence as much as possible. Treaties were still signed, annuities distributed, and promises made, though as always these promises were not consistently kept. The Cherokee used their institutions to negotiate with federal authorities, seeking to protect their sovereignty and prevent further encroachment. Internal divisions did not disappear. The conflict between the Ross faction and those associated with the Treaty Party lingered, creating tension in politics and society. Yet over time, the need for unity became clearer, especially as external threats persisted. Leaders worked to reconcile factions, emphasizing the importance of national survival over personal grievances. The assassinations of Ridge, Boudinot, and others had revealed the dangers of division, and the memory of that violence pressed the nation toward healing. Economic recovery extended beyond farming. Cherokee artisans continued to produce baskets, pottery, and other crafts, both for their own use and for trade. markets developed where Cherokee goods were exchanged with neighbouring native nations and with American traders. Roads, ferries, and small businesses emerged, creating a modest but functioning economy. Some Cherokee entered professions such as law, medicine, and politics, reflecting the influence of education and the blending of traditions with modern forms. The presence of other removed nations in Indian Territory added another dimension. The Cherokee were relocated alongside the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, who each faced their own struggles of rebuilding. Relations among these nations were sometimes cooperative, sometimes tense, as they negotiated boundaries, alliances, and rivalries. Together, they formed what came to be called the Five Civilized Tribes, a label reflecting their adoption of certain American institutions, but also a recognition of their resilience. The Cherokee, with their constitution, schools, and press, were often seen as leaders among them. Rebuilding also required addressing justice. Courts operated to resolve disputes, enforce laws, and provide order. The application of law reflected both Cherokee traditions and American influences, creating a hybrid system that balanced clan responsibilities with national authority. Criminal cases, property disputes, and political conflicts were adjudicated, ensuring that governance was more than symbolic. Law became a tool of survival, reinforcing the legitimacy of the National Council and its leaders. The decades after removal were not free of hardship. Disease continued to strike, poverty was widespread, and relations with the United States remained fraught. Yet the Cherokee proved capable of endurance. By the mid-19th century, their nation in Indian Territory was stable, with functioning institutions, a thriving press, and a population that had begun to recover. The trauma of removal remained, but it did not define them entirely. They were a people who had endured exile and rebuilt, carrying their traditions into a new era. The work of rebuilding in Indian Territory was not only about survival, but about asserting a future. Leaders emphasized that their children would inherit not just sorrow but strength, not just loss but resilience. Schools taught history alongside reading and writing, ensuring that new generations understood both the pain of removal and the importance of national identity. The presence of the syllabary, the newspaper, and the Constitution gave shape to this identity, anchoring the people in continuity even as the world around them shifted. From the foundation laid in Indian Territory, the Cherokee would face new challenges as the 19th century unfolded. The Civil War would divide them once again, drawing them into a conflict that tested their unity and sovereignty. Yet the rebuilding of the 1840s and 1850s ensured that when those storms arrived, the Cherokee had institutions, leaders, and traditions strong enough to endure. When the United States fractured in 1861, the Cherokee Nation, already rebuilt in Indian Territory after the trauma of removal, was pulled into another struggle that was not of their own making, but which would once again divide their people and reshape their future. The Civil War in America was fought between North and South, Union and Confederacy, but for the Cherokee it was also a civil war within their own nation, pitting families, clans, and leaders against one another. The pressures of loyalty, survival, sovereignty, and outside influence collided in ways that made the era one of the most turbulent in Cherokee history. By the 1850s, the Cherokee Nation in Indian Territory had rebuilt much of what had been lost during removal. A functioning capital at Tahlequah housed the National Council and courts. Schools were operating, the Cherokee Advocates circulated as a national newspaper, and farms once again produced surplus crops. Political division still lingered from the removal era, particularly between supporters of John Ross and the descendants of the Ridge-Boudinot faction, but the nation was relatively stable. That stability, however, was threatened when the United States itself broke apart. The Civil War was fought over slavery, sectional power, and the fate of the Union. But for the Cherokee, it presented an impossible choice. The United States federal government had betrayed them repeatedly, breaking treaties, failing to enforce Supreme Court rulings, and forcing their removal. The Confederacy, on the other hand, promised recognition of their sovereignty and potential protection of their lands. But it was tied to an institution, slavery, that divided Cherokee society and threatened to entangle them further in the politics of the South. Slavery existed within the Cherokee Nation, though not universally. Some wealthy Cherokee families, often those who had adopted plantation-style farming, owned enslaved African Americans. Others opposed slavery, viewing it as incompatible with Cherokee traditions and values. This division mirrored the broader tensions in the United States, creating fault lines within the nation even before the war began. When the Confederacy courted native nations, offering alliances and recognition, some Cherokee leaders were inclined to accept, while others resisted, fearing entanglement in a war that could bring devastation once again. John Ross, principal chief, initially sought neutrality. He argued that the Cherokee should remain out of the conflict, preserving their nation by avoiding alliance with either side. This stance reflected the desire of many Cherokee to avoid another catastrophe like the Trail of Tears, to focus on rebuilding rather than fighting in a foreign war. But neutrality proved impossible. Indian territory lay in the path of armies. Confederate agents pressed for alliances, and divisions within the nation made it difficult to maintain a unified position. In 1861, under pressure, and facing the collapse of federal authority in Indian Territory, Ross signed a treaty of alliance with the Confederacy. The treaty promised recognition of the Cherokee as a sovereign nation, representation in the Confederate Congress, and support for their institutions. At first, this seemed a pragmatic choice, aligning with the power that controlled the region. But the alliance quickly unravelled. Ross himself was never fully committed to the Confederate cause, and many Cherokee opposed the decision. As the war dragged on, divisions deepened. A significant portion of the Cherokee sided with the Union, forming regiments of Cherokee soldiers who fought under federal command. Others remained with the Confederacy, joining units such as the Cherokee Mounted Rifles under the command of Stan Wasey, a leader of the Ridge Boudinot faction. Wasey became one of the most prominent Cherokee figures of the war, rising to the rank of Brigadier General in the Confederate Army, the only Native American to hold such a rank. He led raids, skirmishes, and battles across Indian Territory, earning both respect and controversy for his leadership. The conflict within the Cherokee Nation was brutal. Families and towns were divided, with brothers fighting on opposite sides. Raids and reprisals swept across Indian Territory, destroying farms, burning homes, and leaving civilians caught in the crossfire. The war disrupted agriculture, leading to shortages of food and supplies. Disease spread in the crowded camps of soldiers and refugees. The suffering was compounded by the memory of removal, as once again the Cherokee found themselves uprooted, displaced, and torn apart by forces beyond their control. John Ross eventually abandoned the Confederate alliance, fleeing to Union-controlled territory and pledging loyalty to the federal government. His shift reflected both his personal convictions and the broader movement of many Cherokee toward the Union, as the Confederacy's promises proved hollow. Yet this reversal further deepened divisions within the nation, with Stan Wasey and his followers continuing to fight for the Confederacy until the very end. The war left Indian Territory devastated. Towns were burned, farms ruined, and thousands of Cherokee displaced once again. The internal divisions weakened national unity, leaving scars that would endure long after the fighting ended. When the Confederacy collapsed in 1865, Stan Wasey was among the last generals to surrender, finally laying down arms in June of that year. His surrender marked not only the end of Cherokee involvement in the war, but also the beginning of a new and difficult chapter in their relationship with the United States. In the aftermath of the war, the federal government imposed harsh terms on the Cherokee. Because portions of the nation had allied with the Confederacy, Washington treated them as a defeated enemy, rather than as a sovereign ally. New treaties demanded further land cessions, the abolition of slavery within the nation, and the granting of full citizenship to freed people. These requirements reshaped Cherokee society, forcing it to confront the legacy of slavery and to integrate freedmen into the nation. The debates over citizenship and belonging that began in this period would continue to resonate for generations. The Civil War era was thus a time of both destruction and transformation. It revealed the fragility of unity within the Cherokee Nation, the dangers of external alliances, and the resilience of a people determined to endure even in the face of civil conflict. The divisions it created were painful, but the process of rebuilding after the war once again demonstrated the capacity of the Cherokee to adapt, to reconcile, and to move forward. From the ashes of the Civil War, the Cherokee entered the Reconstruction era, facing the challenges of integrating freed people, rebuilding their institutions, and defending their sovereignty in a world where federal power was stronger than ever. When the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Cherokee people were living with the legacies of removal, rebuilding, and civil war. Indian Territory, where they had been forced after the Trail of Tears, was transformed in 1907 into the state of Oklahoma, a change that stripped away much of the political autonomy they had fought to preserve. Yet even under the weight of federal assimilation policies, allotment of land, and the dissolution of their government, the Cherokee endured. The 20th century became a story of survival in the face of erasure, adaptation to shifting political and social landscapes, and gradual renewal of sovereignty through persistent struggle. The opening decades of the century were shaped by the Dawes Act and its impact on Cherokee society. In the late 19th century, the federal government had moved to dismantle tribal landholdings by allotting parcels to individual native citizens while declaring surplus lands open for white settlement. This policy was meant to break apart communal landholding and force native peoples into the model of small-scale American farmers. For the Cherokee, it was another assault on sovereignty. Lands that had been held collectively for the nation were surveyed and divided, often fraudulently, with non-Cherokees acquiring large portions through manipulation, sales, or outright theft. By 1907, when Oklahoma became a state, the communal land base of the Cherokee was shattered, and their government had been formally dissolved by federal decree. The dismantling of the Cherokee Nation's government was not the end of political life, however. Leaders continued to meet informally, holding councils and preserving traditions of governance even without official recognition. Families maintained clan ties, ceremonies continued at stomp grounds, and the language carried forward in homes and churches. While the federal government sought to assimilate native peoples through boarding schools and policies of suppression, the Cherokee adapted, holding on to identity in ways that could not be erased. Boarding schools became one of the most powerful tools of assimilation in the early 20th century. Cherokee children, like those from many native nations, were taken from their families and placed in institutions where they were forbidden to speak their language, punished for practicing traditions, and taught to adopt English, Christianity, and American cultural norms. The trauma of these schools was profound, severing children from parents, eroding transmission of language, and instilling shame in cultural identity. Yet even within these institutions, Cherokee resilience showed. Some children whispered in their language when teachers were not listening. Others carried memories of home that they passed on later in life. And some used the education they received to fight for native rights in the decades ahead. The pressures of assimilation were felt across all aspects of life. Federal policy sought to make native people into American farmers, laborers, and citizens while erasing their nations. But Cherokee traditions adapted. Ceremonial grounds continued to host dances and rituals, often quietly or away from the watchful eyes of officials. Storytelling endured, passing memory across generations. Christianity, once imposed through mission schools, was reshaped into Cherokee forms, blending hymns with traditional rhythms and producing communities of faith that carried dual identities. Identity was never erased, only reshaped, surviving in forms that ensured continuity. The allotment of land created widespread poverty. Many families lost their farms to taxes, debts, or fraudulent sales. With the land base diminished, wage labour became increasingly important. Cherokee men and women worked in agriculture, ranching, and later in oil fields, factories, and urban centres. Migration to cities grew in the 20th century, as opportunities for work drew families to Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and beyond. In these urban settings, Cherokee identity faced new challenges as individuals navigated life away from traditional communities. Yet even there, families maintained connections to ceremonial grounds, language and heritage, often travelling back for dances, reunions and ceremonies. The federal government's policies shifted during the 20th century. In the 1930s, under the Indian Reorganization Act, some tribal governments were restored, though often under models imposed by Washington. For the Cherokee, whose government had been dissolved in 1907, this was both an opportunity and a challenge. Limited recognition was granted, and leaders began to reassert national identity through councils and organizations. Yet the constraints of federal oversight meant that sovereignty was incomplete, and the struggle for recognition continued. World War II brought new experiences for the Cherokee. Hundreds served in the armed forces, fighting in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. Some became part of the famous Native Code Talker programs, though Cherokee involvement was less widely publicized than that of the Navajo. Service in the military exposed young Cherokee men and women to broader worlds, instilled pride, and deepened the sense of belonging both to the Cherokee Nation and to the United States. At home, women worked in factories, contributing to the war effort. The sacrifices of this generation highlighted both patriotism and the continuing resilience of identity. The post-war decades brought new struggles. The federal government shifted once again, adopting policies of termination in the 1950s that sought to dissolve native nations altogether and integrate individuals fully into American society. For the Cherokee, whose sovereignty had already been undermined, termination threatened to erase what little recognition remained. Yet resistance was strong. Leaders, activists, and community members organized to protect identity, land, and culture. They argued that the Cherokee Nation had never ceased to exist, even if the United States claimed otherwise. The civil rights era of the 1960s energized Cherokee activism. Inspired by broader movements for racial justice, Cherokee leaders joined with other Native activists in demanding recognition, rights, and the restoration of sovereignty. Organizations were formed, cultural programs expanded, and voices were raised in Washington. The American Indian movement, while often associated with more militant protests, shared the broader goal of Native survival and pride. For the Cherokee, the movement affirmed that they were not relics of the past, but living nations with the right to determine their own futures. In 1971, a major turning point came when the Cherokee Nation elected a principal chief for the first time in decades. W. W. Keeler, who had been appointed by the federal government in the 1940s, was elected under a new framework that allowed for greater self-governance. This marked the beginning of a revival of Cherokee political authority. The nation adopted a new constitution in the 1970s, re-establishing a modern form of government with executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Recognition of sovereignty expanded, allowing the Cherokee to administer programs, schools, and services for their citizens. Cultural revival accompanied political renewal. Programs to teach the Cherokee language were developed, seeking to preserve and spread fluency at a time when English had become dominant. Ceremonial grounds were revitalized, and traditions such as stomp dances, stickball, and storytelling were celebrated openly. Museums, cultural centers, and archives were created to preserve history and educate new generations. The syllabary, still in use, became a symbol of pride, appearing in publications, signage, and educational materials. Economic development became another focus in the late 20th century. The Cherokee Nation, like many tribes, invested in businesses, enterprises, and later gaming operations to generate revenue for services. profits-funded schools, healthcare, housing, and cultural programs, strengthening the nation's ability to support its citizens. This economic power also reinforced sovereignty, reducing dependence on federal funding and demonstrating the capacity of native nations to govern their own affairs successfully. The 20th century was thus a story of both hardship and renewal. The Cherokee endured allotment, assimilation, and suppression, but they adapted, resisting erasure and reclaiming sovereignty. They built modern institutions while preserving tradition, creating a nation that could navigate the challenges of the modern world without losing its identity. Families carried memory across generations, leaders fought for recognition, and communities rebuilt what had been taken. By the close of the century, the Cherokee Nation stood not as a relic of the past, but as one of the largest and most vibrant native nations in the United States. Its citizens lived in Oklahoma and across the country, participating in every sector of society while remaining tied to their heritage. The survival and adaptation of the 20th century laid the groundwork for the 21st, when Cherokee identity, sovereignty, and resilience would continue to define the present and shape the future. From this hard-won survival, the Cherokee entered the modern era, carrying forward the lessons of endurance, resistance, and renewal into a world where identity and sovereignty remained vital in the face of new challenges and opportunities. The story of the Cherokee did not end with removal, allotment, or the hardships of the 20th century. Today, the Cherokee Nation stands as one of the largest and most visible native nations in the United States, with a population that extends across Oklahoma and into every corner of the country. It is a people defined by resilience, adaptation, and the constant renewal of identity. The centuries of upheaval left scars, but they also forged a strength that continues to shape Cherokee life in the modern world. The Cherokee Nation, headquartered in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, serves as the center of governance and cultural life for hundreds of thousands of citizens. Its government, modeled on both traditional values and modern democratic principles, includes executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The principal chief leads the nation, supported by a council that represents districts across the Cherokee population. This structure reflects both continuity with the constitution adopted in the early 19th century and the adaptations necessary for life in the 21st. Through it, the nation administers programs in healthcare, education, housing, and economic development, demonstrating sovereignty in practice rather than in words alone. Healthcare has become one of the most significant areas of investment. The Cherokee Nation operates hospitals and clinics that serve not only Cherokee citizens but also members of other native nations in the region. These facilities provide services ranging from routine care to specialized treatment, reflecting the nation's commitment to the well-being of its people. The investment in healthcare is more than practical. It is an assertion of responsibility, a declaration that the community cares for its members and that sovereignty includes the ability to provide for basic human needs. Education remains a central focus as well. Schools supported by the nation, along with scholarship programs for higher education, reflect the understanding that survival in the modern world requires both cultural continuity and participation in broader society. Language revitalization is especially important. After decades of decline due to assimilation policies and the boarding school era, the Cherokee language has become the focus of renewed effort. Immersion schools teach children entirely in Cherokee, ensuring that fluency is passed to a new generation. Adult programs support language learners, while digital tools and media extend the reach of instruction across the globe. The syllabary, created by Sequoyah nearly 2 centuries ago, appears in textbooks, signage, and even smartphones, a reminder of both heritage and adaptability. Cultural preservation goes hand in hand with these efforts. Ceremonial grounds remain active, where dances, songs, and rituals continue to bind communities to tradition. Storytelling thrives, both orally and in written form, ensuring that myths, histories, and teachings are passed down. Crafts such as basket weaving, beadwork, and pottery are taught in workshops and schools, not as relics but as living practices that carry forward ancestral knowledge. Museums and cultural centres preserve artefacts and interpret history, presenting the Cherokee story to both citizens and visitors. The Cherokee Heritage Centre near Tahlequah serves as a hub for this work, offering exhibits, performances, and educational programs that connect the present with the past. Economic development has become a cornerstone of modern Cherokee sovereignty. Enterprises owned by the nation include businesses, manufacturing and gaming operations that generate revenue to fund services. Profits are reinvested in schools, healthcare, housing and cultural programs, ensuring that economic power supports the well-being of the people. This development demonstrates that sovereignty is not abstract but tangible, expressed in the ability to provide jobs, build infrastructure, and invest in the future. It also allows the Cherokee to interact with global markets on their own terms, balancing tradition with participation in the wider economy. Political activism continues to shape Cherokee life today. Leaders engage with state and federal governments, advocating for native rights, environmental protection, and recognition of sovereignty. Court cases, legislation, and lobbying efforts reflect a determination to ensure that promises made in treaties are honoured, and that the Cherokee remain visible in national debates. This activism is not limited to leadership alone. Grassroots movements among Cherokee citizens address issues such as land rights, climate change, healthcare access, and cultural preservation, reflecting the vitality of civic life within the nation. Identity in the modern era is complex, shaped by both continuity and change. Cherokee citizens live across the United States, often far from Oklahoma, yet they remain tied to the nation through family, community, and shared heritage. Some speak the language fluently, while others are learning it anew. Some participate regularly in ceremonial grounds, while others connect through cultural events, media, or digital communities. Identity is not uniform, but it is resilient, adapting to circumstances while retaining its core. The Cherokee people also continue to confront challenges. Poverty, health disparities, and the ongoing decline of fluent language speakers remain pressing concerns. The legacy of boarding schools, assimilation policies, and land loss still weighs heavily, manifesting in struggles with cultural transmission, mental health, and historical trauma. Yet alongside these challenges are efforts of healing and renewal. Programs address trauma directly, supporting mental health and community wellness. Language revitalization combats loss with creativity and passion. Cultural education ensures that young people grow up with pride in who they are, rather than shame imposed by outsiders. The Cherokee story today is not confined to Oklahoma. Citizens live in cities across the United States and beyond, contributing to every field of modern life: politics, education, medicine, the arts, science, and business. Cherokee identity in diaspora reflects both adaptation and continuity, as families maintain connections through travel, communication, and cultural events. Social media, online classes, and digital archives allow citizens thousands of miles away to participate in language lessons, watch ceremonies, or read news from the Cherokee Phoenix. The nation has embraced technology as a tool of survival, turning modern platforms into extensions of ancient traditions. Art and literature flourish among contemporary Cherokee as well. Writers, poets, musicians, and visual artists draw on heritage to create works that speak to both native and global audiences. Their work often reflects themes of survival, resilience, and identity, challenging stereotypes and presenting the Cherokee as a people rooted in history yet fully engaged in the present. Artists such as Will Rogers in the early 20th century and Joy Harjo, the US poet laureate of Muskogee descent but with deep ties to Cherokee traditions, illustrate the prominence of native voices in American culture. Cherokee artists contribute to this broader renaissance. ensuring that cultural expression remains central to identity. The Cherokee Nation today is not only the largest federally recognized tribe in the United States, but also one of the most influential. Its citizens number in the hundreds of thousands, and its government wields significant political and economic power. Yet this prominence does not erase the memory of removal, allotment, or the centuries of struggle. Instead, it underscores the resilience of a people who endured and rebuilt, carrying identity forward into each new generation. The renewal of Cherokee life in the modern era is a reminder that sovereignty, identity, and culture are not static but living forces. They have survived removal, civil war, allotment, assimilation, and poverty. They have adapted to new technologies, economies, and political realities, and they continue to inspire pride, determination, and hope. From ancient stories of creation and the sacred fire to the modern classrooms where children learn the syllabary on tablets, the continuity of the Cherokee people endures. They remain a nation defined not by loss alone, but by survival, resilience, and the constant renewal of identity in the face of change.